across the UK. On DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Well, hello, my name's Jonathan Gullis. I'm sitting in for the great Ian Collins here on the home of Common Sense, that is Talk. And coming up in today's show, with his first year in number 10, fast approaching, Prime Minister Keir Starmer is still racking up the U-turns, this time caving to welfare rebels on disability benefits and rowing back on his Island of Strangers immigration warning. Meanwhile, Britain's on the cusp of a new immigration deal with France to curb small boats crossings, a one in and one out plan where each deportee from the UK is swapped for someone in France with the right to be here. And 4 people have been arrested, 3 charged with terror offences after 2 RAF Voyager aircraft were damaged at Brize Norton in an attack claimed by Palestine Action. We want to hear what your views on those stories are, so call in at 0344 499 1000, text in the word TALK to start your message to 87222, and you can follow us on X as well as message us on @talktv. And in the studio, I'm delighted to be joined by former Labour advisor and political commentator Matthew Torbitt, who's going to be giving his analysis and his views on the show as we go through. And our first question that we want to throw out to you, the audience, is Keir Starmer has been doing a lot of U-turning and he's been doing a lot of apologising in an exclusive interview with The Observer, Tom Baldwin today. Are you willing to forgive and forget the Prime Minister's mistakes? You know how to get in touch and share us those views, and make sure you do too. Well, ladies and gentlemen of this great nation of ours, it's almost been a year with Keir. We were promised change, and by God did we get it. But no one meant that meant changing your mind. Keir Starmer has now perfected 3 U-turns in the space of 1 month. First of all, on winter fuel payments for pensioners, when he got an absolute shellacking in the local elections and grovelled and apologised, hoping those voters will one day forgive him, having marched his members of parliament up the hill to vote to axe the winter fuel payments for millions of pensioners across the country, only to march them back down the hill to now be voting to U-turn on it. Then comes the National Rape Gang inquiry, where again Sir Keir Starmer had his MPs march up the hill to vote against the national inquiry in January this year, based on an amendment laid by the Conservative Party, only now to be told by Baroness Casey that one is indeed needed. This is the same Prime Minister that told us as a nation that if you wanted a national inquiry, you were jumping on the bandwagon of the far right. And then we now have today's welfare U-turn, where Sir Keir Starmer has created, let's not be shocked by it, a 2-tier system where if someone with Parkinson's unable to dress themselves is on PIP today, they will continue to get that payment. But after November 2026, if the same person with the same diagnosis, the same challenges, has those problems, they will not get that important support. And it's cost him, out of the £5 billion he was hoping to save, £3 billion, in the hope that that will buy off the 120 plus rebels signing that amendment that might well still come to haunt him on Tuesday's vote, with the number 10 saying they still don't know if they can even win the vote. And then, as I say, the Prime Minister's done this interview with The Observer's Tom Baldwin, the man who wrote his biography, and wow, what an amazing amount of stuff that's in there. First of all, he wants us to forget about free gear Keir. He says that the glasses, the clothes, the concert tickets and football box at Arsenal is something that we shouldn't worry about. At the end of the day, he did nothing wrong and the optics of it don't matter. Do you think it matters? I think it does. He now says, and I quote, he deeply regrets speaking the truth on immigration when he said that mass migration meant the UK is becoming, and I quote, an island of strangers. This was meant to be the speech where the Prime Minister had a great U-turn and a great ability to reset his government to show that they could take on Reform UK when it came to the issue of migration. And then he says Sue Gray, the woman he appointed to be his Chief of Staff, was not fit or able to be the Chief of Staff in number 10 Downing Street, and that we should judge him for his judgment. Well, Keir, we do. Let's have a look at what you've done. Your 2-tier justice means that someone who's sent a hurty tweet is in prison for longer than someone who's a convicted paedophile. Taxes are up, debts are up, borrowing's up, inflation's up, unemployment's up. Factories in places like Stoke-on-Trent are shutting due to Ed Miliband's disastrous net zero agenda, and the economy at best is stagnant. All haunted by that Halloween budget that has wide repercussions across the country. I think we all know we're pretty sick and tired of this first year with Keir. But let's get to Matthew Torbitt, a great voice of common sense here on a friend of us on Talk. Matthew, you've heard the rant that I've just had to have there. Have I been fair? Does Keir deserve the ability for us to forgive and forget for the mistakes that he's made?
First of all, I'm glad you put former advisor in the end in front of my introduction, because I would have not told them to have done any of this. I don't want to be any blame laid at my door. I saw this coming. That's why I got out. No, you've got to ask for forgiveness. I get where he's sort of maybe coming from. If I was to be generous, and I know you also no doubt agree, you know, it was a mess he was left with. Ultimately, it was always going to be tricky, right? But it's about the political decisions that you make because of that. I think going after... I always thought it'd be terminal when he went for the winter fuel allowance. I could not understand electorally why you would go after older people when they are statistically always the ones that will go out and vote at election time. So you are totally getting rid of a huge amount of your voter base. The welfare reforms, for me, have only added to that. And if this passes, it's done. I think it's done anyway, but this alone would finish it. And I'll tell you why. There's a stat I saw in the week. I was very fortunate to have some data shared with me by the freelance journalist Chaminda Gianetti, along with David Littlefair, who organises a lot of groups within the Labour Party. Within each constituency, there are 50 constituencies that have more people on PIP than there are Labour MPs majority in those 50 seats. So you might as well throw away 50 seats straight away. If you're a disabled person that feels attacked by this government, you're not voting for him next time round. That's as simple as it is. Now, if we were to presume that that one person could influence two other people in their lives, maybe family members, mum, dads, daughters, sons, whatever, friends, that would affect 280 constituencies. Therefore, that's 280 seats gone, based on 2024 election numbers. So electorally, they've been bizarre. Sue Gray was an interesting one, because I thought it said a lot about her political judgment and why she probably wasn't fit for the job. The only interaction I had with her, I asked her for something. She did it almost immediately from her own email account, didn't ask staff to do it. It was a very small thing, wasn't it? You know, I basically was asking, could she put a word in for somebody for a job in government? And why I think somebody who's been wasted in admin roles in the party when they'd worked in government previously. It was bizarre that they were in such a junior position. I went out to bat for them, and she came back immediately and set up a meeting. And I thought, oh, she gets stuff done. However, if she had not made the poor error of judgment in coming across to work for Keir, she'd have had Simon Casey's job now as head of the civil service, which is the job she always wanted to do. And if Keir was obviously knew her previously from Northern Ireland and elsewhere, clearly was very fond of her, she would have that job. Her poor political judgment was to go and help the leader of the opposition just after a very damning report into the current Prime Minister, and then try and carry that on as if you weren't going to be a household name, which is never good for somebody behind the scenes to be. It started from minute one, didn't it, with the free gifts, which I always, whenever there was anybody with lots of money that wanted to donate to an MP I worked for, I would always be very cautious, because you don't know what they've said before as somebody that may be prominent in the business world or whatever they might be, where they stood on certain issues, what they'd maybe written in the past. You'd have to do a total due diligence. And I get Lord Ali's a Labour MP, a Labour Lord in his own right. He's been around the Labour Party a long time, was a big part of Tony Blair's whole programme and influencing him. But there's this weird thing about elites, I would say. I was going to say liberals, I'd say elites, actually, where I used to, in my younger days, go to Tory party conference in Manchester and protest outside and say, your party were the nasty ones, the horrible ones, for the rich, didn't care, you know, totally.
We may have crossed paths, Matthew. We may have crossed paths.
Probably did. No, I'd grown out of it by the time you were in, I'm sure. That is a transference even on our side, where there's this attitude of, no, I do that as well. I take freebies, but I'm a responsible person. I'm liberal. I care. They're horrible Tories. We don't, you know, that's totally different. I do this. It cuts across everywhere. And I think when people are feeling the pinch, you've got to think twice. You can go and watch Arsenal whenever. You know, do you have to be there? Be there for the big games. Yeah, I get that. The odd thing. None of it's ever made sense. And even his interview today, I always feel horrible really digging into Keir as a person, but when I dealt with him, he was duplicitous, I would say. And to sort of go, well, I gave this speech, didn't read any of it, didn't believe it. I had to have the box at Arsenal because they told me, and then Arsenal went, no, we didn't. And he's incapable of almost telling the truth. And, you know, politicians have to play a certain game sometimes and get people on side, but he ties himself in knots, it seems. So do you
find that amazing? Like, I found this bit quite incredible, where he was basically, like you say, saying, you know, for example, I got really upset that people attacked my wife about the free clothes she got. Understandably, no one wants to see family members attacked, but this is from the same guy that oversaw a Labour Party that directly attacked Rishi Sunak's wife over her, what was then non-dom status. So if you're going to dish it out, isn't there an element of being accepting to have to take it as well?
Yes, and that's why I think ordinarily, outside of maybe scandals, families a bit, you know, you shouldn't be getting involved.
I agree with you,
that. I think, you know, my partner's in the public eye, and if people are horrible to her online, it gets my back up, as it would do any of us, right? But that's why you don't go for somebody else. I wouldn't dream of doing that about somebody else's partner, not in public and putting things out there. It was useful for them at the time, or for us. My worry was that it would come back on us at some point. Even the personal stuff, I don't know, when they were having a go at Rishi himself over using a private jet, I thought, if he thinks he's never going to have to use a private jet as Prime Minister, we're totally missing how people will view
Well, I think there's
this,
a story in The Sun that says that Ed Miliband has sent a civil servant 10,000 miles round trip to go and scout the hotels in Brazil ahead of a net zero conference. I mean, it's just farcical, isn't it?
It's do as I say, not do as I do, really, isn't it? That's what it is. I don't know the details of that. Depends where they were staying in Brazil. It's not always the safest place. Maybe you would want it scouting out, to be honest with you. And maybe Ed hasn't got the time to go. He's got pressing things to do. But yeah, no, it's easy headlines. It's easy fodder. People will read it and get annoyed, and it just backs up a lot of what people are currently feeling.
From your intel and conversations you're having with members of Parliament on the Labour Party, do you think these concessions are going to be enough? Is this going to save Keir's bacon on Tuesday?
For lots of them, it isn't. If I wouldn't vote for it. I think you're creating a two-tier system of those who are disabled currently before the legislation aren't going to be affected. Those that are and end up going on to PIP after the legislation are going to get a lesser rate, basically. Well, if you've got exactly the same condition as somebody, it doesn't make you any more or less disabled. You still have the same needs, and disabled people, as we know, have greater needs and expenses to get about daily life. That's as simple as it is. We all understand the welfare bill is bloated, and I think there is an element of overdiagnosis and stuff like that, but I think it'd be enough because Meg Hillier's took a name off it. I think Meg Hillier has said great concessions, basically. You know, she's happy she's got an element of a result. I think that's short-sighted. The usual suspects, as the government would call them, the Socialist Campaign Group and some of the lefties that snuck through the net in the last round of selections, essentially, I am certain will be voting against it, and I've seen a couple tweet to that effect. There'll be a fairly sizable rebellion, but the government will survive, essentially.
And then from that, does Keir survive long term? You've been, as you say, quite consistent. Is this the beginning of the end? Has he now given up on the authority of the parliamentary party?
It was the end. It was the beginning of the end. Winterfield. I thought, this is toxic. This is poll tax toxic. Something that cut through like something, and nothing I've seen before in my time in Parliament, in politics. I've always thought 2026, the real knives will be out, because we will lose Wales and Scotland, and you know, we were ahead in Scotland. Wales has always been Labour. That's a surefire sign, as a backbencher with a small majority, you're not having a job in 2 years. So
do you not think with Scotland seeing that by-election for the Scottish Parliament, there's an opportunity, the SNP being in for nearly coming up to 33 decades, that actually Labour can maybe survive in Scotland? That in itself would save Keir Starmer?
I think you can look at that. By-elections are tricky. The same with Reform in Runcorn. Does that mean they're going to end up with some overall majority because it's one of Labour's safest seats? I think they come around in weird circumstances. I think party will take great hope from it. I think they may do better than what people think. I think the Reform, whether you're Tory, Labour, potentially even SNP in some cases, they are the spoiler. They're going to take votes from all over the show because they don't have an ideology. They don't have a real sort of that core belief system, but they represent, and people take it as a negative, they represent a protest vote in the sense of, we are fed up, so we're going to put our faith in these essentially new guys. And Nigel's been around a long time, but as an MP, the new guys, because we've tried a mixture of all of you lot, and all you've done is let us down. We feel worse off than we ever have. So the only reason Keir may stay longer is Rachel Reeves gets all the flack at the moment, and that's very useful for number 10 to sort of say keep kicking Rachel, and then he might get rid of her.
And interestingly, we are starting to see those briefings coming out of number 10 to point to Rachel Reeves. Before we go to the quick break, I've got a couple of texts here. One from Barry saying, I'm not willing to forgive Keir Starmer for the damage he's inflicting on this country, and the Tories either. You are just as complicit. This once great country I have fought for is a shambles. Another one from Alan in Merseyside. This is not what you expect to read something from Merseyside. Starmer says he shouldn't have used words in his stranger speech. Lucy Connolly says she shouldn't have used certain words, so they jailed her for 2.5 years with no forgiveness. Something to think about. We'll be back after the break.
When we look at the savings that he was trying to make, £5 billion. Now, it may sound like a lot of money, but in the grand scheme of a big government budget, when you're spending, effectively trillions of pounds every single year, it's kind of small fry. The fact is, she's now going to have to find some money to pay for all of this, and it looks like taxes are going to go up, or some savings are going to have to be found from somewhere.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on the app, on your mobile, the home of common sense. This is Talk.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's me, Jonathan Gullis, sitting in for the great Ian Collins here on the home of common sense. That is Talk, and I'm great and delighted to be joined in the studio by Matthew Torbitt, former Labour advisor and political commentator. And we're going to carry on going across the stories out and about today. First of all, obviously, we're going to talk about Palestine Action, where we've had that breaking news during Alex Phillips' show that says 2 men and 2 women detained in total after planes damaged at RAF Brize Norton. A woman, 29, of no fixed abode, and 2 men aged 36 and 24 from London were arrested on suspicion of the commission, preparation or instigation of acts of terrorism, contrary to section 41 of the Terrorism Act 2000. And another woman, 41, again of no fixed abode, was arrested on suspicion of assisting an offender. So 4 arrests have been made, 3 of which are under the Terror Act. Matthew, just your take on that. Is this welcome? Is this necessary? Or do you think using the Terror Act is a little OTT?
I think you've got to send a message, probably. What the individuals did was stupid. The concerns I have with prescribing groups like Palestinian Action is, are we just prescribing people because we disagree with them, essentially? If it was somebody with more nefarious aims, yes, that it could have been very dangerous, but that's why I think the real question is, why has nobody been sacked? Or why has nobody... really, the whole thing stops with people that are overseeing security at Brize Norton. The bizarre... Have you seen the pictures of the fact that it's just a fence?
I think it literally looked like a garden fence. I was gobsmacked to see that, yeah.
And, you'd be a bit daft to go over there. You might think you might get shot or something like that. But I struggle with prescribing groups like this when we haven't even prescribed, after I spent my last 2 years in Parliament trying to get the government to do it, prescribing groups like the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. And for whatever reason, even Labour government's still dragging its feet over.
That was a manifesto pledge, wasn't it, from Labour on that one?
And
I agree. And by the way, the Conservatives likewise talk the talk but fail to actually prescribe, so don't think I'm laying blame on Labour's or the Conservatives, and I agree. That group 100%, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, should be prescribed. But can you see why entering and damaging aircraft is essentially an act of terror when you're attacking a state's ability to defend itself, and therefore we have to use the full force, especially when, as written by or exposed by the Telegraph, it says here that they've managed to infiltrate some messages amongst the Palestinian Action group that says that outlined a list of new targets, these targets being RAF bases, RAF Cranwell, RAF Barkston Heath, both in Lincolnshire, and RAF Valley in Anglesey, North Wales. And in this group, there's a number of organisers some are nursery teachers and surgeons, but I'm not going to shock you, Matthew. Number one, if you're a public sector worker and you're in this group and it's now a prescribed group, you should be immediately sacked from the public sector, have no access to the public sector, and we should be hounding these people out immediately and actually considering doing raids on their homes just to really make sure that they haven't got any terror materials, because obviously they're a danger now to society. Second of all, the fact that they want to continue the action only goes to prove the very point of why they needed to be prescribed. And thirdly, and you've heard me say it before, Matthew, if you enter a RAF or any military base, you should be willing to be dying for your cause, because I would want to see troops taking aim and fire at those individuals who break onto a base. And then, obviously, if they manage to somehow evade, they should be captured under terror laws and rightly put in prison for a very long time. There's just some food for thought there for you to respond to.
My assumption, if I was to go onto a RAF base and mess about on an e-scooter, is I would be shot. That would be my assumption, right? That would be my starting point. Which again, it concerns me why they've got so close and done this. This is where it comes back to the security for me. It doesn't read very well. These people, it reminds me a little bit of Extinction Rebellion, and I'm sure all their hearts are in the right places for the cause they believe in, but they're normally middle-class yuppie types that haven't got anything better to do, therefore they feel like they want... The interesting thing about this is, though, I think there's probably a loophole in international law that the government may find themselves in trouble with, because there's been 3 instances of this in the past, which I think I spoke to you about the other night.
Yes, we did.
And all 3 groups got off because there was a genuine fear that war crimes may be being committed, and they wished to stop that. Therefore, within I think probably the ECHR, I'd assume, they were within their rights to try and challenge and stop that. And one of the people that defended one of the successful, he was a gentleman at the time in the early noughties, maybe over Iraq, I think, was Keir Starmer as a barrister and a human rights.
I think Kemi Badenoch is what they've called put the receipts on social media, hasn't she?
Actually, I've not seen that.
I'm trying to be in with the crowd, I think, but like she's put the receipts down. And actually, Robert Jenrick has alleged that whilst Number 10 has claimed that Keir Starmer had to defend those individuals, Robert Jenrick has alleged that the people involved who he defended have said that he volunteered. Going back to one of your earlier points, which is, it's sometimes hard to know which version of the truth we're meant to believe with Keir Starmer.
Well, I suppose you look at a time where barristers don't always tell the truth, do they? I suppose I was going to say if he's chosen to take on cases, you could assume he was maybe quite radical. So, the whole McDonald's case that he took on and helping with the group involved with McLibel, death penalty in colonial countries, supposedly helping the miners, although I'm not sure I quite believe that, actually, and representing their families, and stuff like this. He obviously wrote a very now famous op-ed for I think The Guardian, which is about right, it's his favourite newspaper, against the Iraq war. So if he was willing to go and defend people that thought they were potentially stopping war crimes, that would tally up with maybe where his real feelings lie. I think that's the greatest frustration with most Labour people, members, MPs, whatever. We've laid a lot of blame at the door of Sue Gray last year, a lot of blame yesterday at Morgan McSweeney's door. Keir's in charge, he's the leader, the buck stops with him. When are you going to just follow through on what you believe and what you think is right and go with your gut? If it doesn't work, you lose the election. At least you went, well, I did what I thought was right. But he appears not willing to do that because he's always been a career civil servant and always worked there, and he appears to want to surround himself with other civil servants to make him feel better. So there's no real politics to the man.
Well, another story that's quite interesting is, which I'm sure the government's delighted to try and get it out to try and cover up what's going on welfare, is that they believe that they are in the stages of, or getting close to, negotiating a new deal with France, a one in and one out system for those people who are illegally either coming into France or indeed illegally then crossing the English Channel and coming to the UK. And the idea is that the European Stability Initiative has invited Downing Street twice in the past 8 months to present their ideas. And the idea is that a Channel migrant would be returned to France within 3 to 4 weeks, with very occasional exceptions for people with the strongest family connections to the UK if they've landed in the UK. And in return, the UK would agree to take in a capped number of asylum seekers from the EU. For example, it says here in the article, around 20,000 a year under a time-limited scheme. Is this going to be a way of helping to stop the boats and smash the gangs, as Keir Starmer promised?
Won't stop the boats. It won't, and that's I think the sticking point. I think if you want to drive down numbers, fine. If you want to close down hotels, fine. You know, whatever. The anger, I think, that emanates from people is through turning on their TV and seeing people crossing the channel every day, and the presumption that they're skipping the queue because they're getting healthcare, they're getting access to doctors and dentists, you know, accommodation, if you want to call it that, wherever these people are staying, wherever it is. I've always been of the opinion that if Whitehall is not going to allow you to look at reforming elements of the ECHR, the Human Rights Act and other elements of international law, I think Keir would be better showing some leadership on this and going, I'm going to call an extraordinary summit on the 1951 Convention on Refugees that we all signed up to, many countries after the Second World War, to help Jewish people that were fleeing from all over the show. And the world has changed since 1951, as we know. There's a lot more refugees. The idea of what a refugee is has changed over time. It's very unfortunate, but you have people that used to flee from persecution maybe because of their sexuality, their religion, and you have dictators come, in charge of certain countries. We have people now fleeing because their country is a mess. Well, a lot of the world's in a mess, and therefore we've got to sort of look at what this really means. If you were to offer offshore processing at Calais, in Turkey, in British embassies in certain countries where, you know, stuff's gone bad, Syria and Afghanistan and elsewhere, Ukraine, I think that would be more beneficial, because you're processing people from a national security point of view who are giving their passports in, this is who I am, this is what skills I've got, this is what I want to do. They're not throwing them in the channel and pretending to be from somewhere else. So you're stopping the anger of, and also the politics of sort of reform and going, look, they're not doing anything. You're also placating the left of your party, and where Labour are hemorrhaging votes to the Lib Dems and the Greens because it's technically a safe and legal route. The reason why I think this is possible is because it was offered to Boris Johnson in 2021 by the French Interior Minister. Boris Johnson decided to play games that week and tweeted something inflammatory towards Emmanuel Macron, fell out with him that week and didn't go to the summit Macron put on. But the French offered not only to have a processing centre at Calais, because it wasn't working for either party, but they were going to pay for it as well. We would put our Home Office people in, it'd be our people, all for us, but they were going to pick up the
well, Matthew, before we go to the break, I thought I'd share my views, which I'm sure you can imagine, which is this one in, one out scheme is a disaster, because it's going to mean that, yes, we might keep people then who've got strong family ties. Well, God knows how many people claim they've got strong family ties, and if they claim it, where do we keep them? In France, where they have to then wait to prove it, or do we keep them here in the UK? And then we already have a legal route for families who want to reunite through family reunification. Then we take the cap thing. Well, is the cap negotiable each and every year? The fact we're even going to take people will act as a pull factor to northern France. That means the smugglers are going to go, it's Christmas, because I've got a wide array of people now to sell my goods to. And if I fail to cross on small boat, I'll try and jump on the paid-for ferry from France, P&O maybe, ferry from France over to the UK. And if I don't get lucky there and I get sent back again, then I'll pay another small boat. This is going to do nothing for numbers when you've got 109,000 asylum claims to the year ending March 2025, a 17% increase on the year before. 23,000 people are claiming asylum since between January and March of 2025. The backlog's still at 90,000, a 50% acceptance rate for those people claiming asylum as of the end of March 2025, and 50,000 appeals, up 88% compared to March 2024. That's my rant. It's a disaster. It won't stop the boats. It'll just encourage more people to come, put more money in the pockets of smugglers, and mean that we have more mass migration into this country. But look, is Matthew right, or am I right, or is one of us wrong? Maybe if you want to frame it like that instead. You know how to call in. 0344 499 1000. Text in with the word talk at the start of your message to 87222, or follow and message us on X at talkTV. We'll see you shortly.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is...
Welcome back. It's me, Jonathan Gullis, sitting in for the great Ian Collins on the home of common sense. That is Talk. And I want to get quickly to our next guest. He is called David Simmons, Member of Parliament for Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner, a Conservative and a former colleague of mine. He's also a Shadow Minister overseeing the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government. David, how are you?
Hello again, Jonathan. It's lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you, and thank you for giving your time what will be a busy constituency Friday, hence why you're in the car, making sure you're out and about visiting your constituents. So I appreciate you giving us a bit of your time. David, we've seen that Sir Keir Starmer has made some concessions on the welfare. I'm keen to get your thoughts on two things. Number one, is this just utter chaos in number 10? Is this actually going to help reduce and solve the welfare crisis? And secondly, Kerry Badenoch made an offer to Sir Keir Starmer to lend the votes. Do you think that that deal is now off the table because essentially Sir Keir Starmer's weakening what he's already proposed?
The government's made a right mess of this. We heard Rachel Reeves, when she announced the budget, making assumptions about how she'd balance that by reducing welfare payments. And we know most people in the country feel that we're spending too much on some of these welfare payments. So it's a cross-party agreement about that. But what's clear is there are a lot of those left-wing people on the Labour backbenches who don't like that direction of travel. They've rebelled, despite the fact that at one stage the Prime Minister and the Labour government were saying that they would be kicked out of the Labour Party if they refused to support this. What it means is that that financial statement, which was put forward just a few weeks ago by Rachel Reeves, is now in tatters. There's a huge financial black hole in that, and they need to address the question of how they might begin to balance the books. Now, we know from history, Labour governments tend to go badly wrong with anything to do with finance. It's a surprise in some ways that it's happened so quickly. When we were in government, I know, Jonathan, you were part of that, we had a plan that was around improving the support for people with disabilities who were on benefits but wanted to work or to start working more, because there are many disabled people who already work part-time or just would like to do more if they could increase their skills. And that support was being developed. Now, unfortunately, what's happened here is that's all now gone out of the window because of this Labour backbench rebellion. The government's in a mess, and the big losers in this are going to be those disabled people who wanted to be able to work more, wanted to do more hours, wanted to increase their earnings, who are now going to lose that opportunity because their government has bottled dealing with it.
Out of interest then, David, sorry, just to quickly ask, will the Conservatives lend their support to Labour now, or will they now be opposing? Has that decision yet been made?
We don't know what concessions the Prime Minister has made to try and get his backbenchers back on side yet. So we know that's something they've been negotiating in backrooms for some time. And it seems absolutely crazy to have a government that comes out and says, here is the budget, this is the way that we're going to balance it, this is the plan. We still don't know what it is that they're replacing that with. And clearly, as a Conservative Party, we're going to look at that, see whether there's anything there that we can support. But it looks like what Keir Starmer has done is back down. He's blown that hole in the budget. It's paved the way for significant tax rises to make up for that weakness. And clearly, as a party, we're going to have to look at what that looks like when it emerges into the light, either later today or possibly early next week.
Now, David, as the opposition to His Majesty's government, can I ask you, what's the Conservative plan? What's the alternative? If we don't go ahead with what Sir Keir Starmer is offering, what else can be done? Because surely Sir Keir Starmer's doing what the Conservatives say he should be doing. He's trying to reduce the welfare bill.
The old proverb, you wouldn't start from here, absolutely applies. So we look at just local government, my area, councils are £1.5 billion worse off just because of the increase the government pushed through on national insurance contributions. Most of the extra money that's going into the NHS is just to pay the higher taxes on employment, the higher taxes on jobs that the government have imposed. So none of this is stuff that's going to make a difference to our constituents in the real world. It's just about the government recycling money inside its own budgets. So we wouldn't have imposed some of those higher taxes on jobs. That in turn wouldn't have reduced the numbers of people in work, and that would mean that the whole of the public sector was in a better financial position than it is. This is a black hole that's entirely of their own making. The bits of this plan that are about supporting people to get back into work, those are things that we can support. And we know, any of us who visited a job centre will have heard of the work that they're doing to support people. There's many disabled people who say, I'm currently doing 16 hours a week, but with a bit of extra support, I could raise that up to do 30, 35 hours. People who are doing a job, but could up their skills to do a more significant, more difficult job with higher incomes. We want to support them to do that. And it now looks like the government is casting significant doubt on whether they're going to do that at all. So it's a difficult day for disabled and unemployed constituents. It's a really bad day for the British economy as well.
Well, what else is a bad day, David, is the fact that there was that YouGov poll, that MRP poll, which is obviously one of the gold standard polls that came out, that said the Conservative Party is rest in peace. It's being buried. Only 46 of the 121 of you that were elected would return. I didn't check, David, sorry, to see if you were one of those who survived the massacring. I hope you are, by the way. All I can ask is the Conservative Party over? Does it even matter what the Conservative Party has to say?
It matters very much, as well as being the official opposition. We're in a situation now where we are in opposition as we have been in the past, and we have to show the British voters that we're using that time to reflect on the challenges that face the country and develop the policy solutions that people need. And at the moment, voters are pretty fed up with us. You and I both know the last election was difficult. A lot of voters saying there are many things we're unhappy about, the consequences of COVID, rising cost of living, whatever the reasons behind it, people felt it was time for a change. Now, at the moment, a lot of those voters are feeling a real sense of buyer's remorse. I keep hearing people saying to me, oh, I voted Labour, I stayed at home. I wish I hadn't. Things have got worse under this government. So they're not turning to the Conservatives, they're not turning to Labour. And as we saw in the recent local elections, those voters, some of them went to the Green Party, some of them went to the Liberal Democrats, some of them went to Reform. What we need to do is use this time in opposition to show that we've got a policy programme that would actually work in government. So as voters begin to think about, what's the choice I've got to make at the next general election? Is there a party out there that's offering workable solutions to the challenges that I can see facing the country, that they can see that that is what the Conservative Party is?
But again, this comes to the question, doesn't it, that about 40% now, this YouGov poll, I think, suggested, of the 2024 Conservative voters are now moving to Reform UK. Many voters who maybe don't want this Labour government will now look at the polls and say, particularly Conservative members, Conservative voters, that the only way to be rid of Labour is to now vote Reform. This is a gift that Reform needed, in the sense of showing that they can't just assume they're going to get into power. They will need more people to lend them votes. Is this just frankly a failure of leadership on the behalf of Kemi Badenoch? We've seen the polls have got worse since she's taken over from where they were a historic low in the last general election. Is this something that you put on Kemi's door? Is this just a reform surge that the Conservative Party hasn't figured out how to tackle? Or is it, as I say, that maybe the Conservative brand is so badly damaged it's irreparable?
So we need to step back a little bit from the drama of day-to-day politics. We know as a party we set out that we would go away and reflect, that we wouldn't rush out and try and announce a full policy programme for a general election when such an election is the best part of 4 years away. That what we do is reflect on the fact that the challenges facing our country are evolving. I know earlier on I was listening to the conversation that was talking about migration, how that's changed even in the short period of time since the elections last year. So we need to make sure that the policies that we're coming forward with are the right ones for the challenges that face the country when that election is in people's minds. And we know at the moment we're not getting a hearing in all quarters, largely because of the fact we've just had a general election. Voters feel quite sort of, I suppose, fed up with the situation that they see in their lives, and they want evidence that things are going to move on. And we need to make sure that when we articulate that policy programme, people can see that it is something where they can show in their own lives how it would improve things. And we know Reform are out there saying we want massive increases in government spending and huge tax cuts. We want to nationalise lots of industries, many of which are things that people absolutely don't want to support. But at the moment, on some quarters, they're getting a hearing. And on the other side of things, you've got the likes of the Liberal Democrats and the Green Party arguing for all sorts of different things. We need to make sure that as voters begin that serious reflection, what kind of leadership does my country need, that we're doing the work that Kemi's leading at the moment, that can show that policy programme.
But David, may I just challenge, sorry, because you're talking here about obviously policy, and I frankly think that maybe you just don't have the luxury of time to sit on the sidelines and not come up with things. But let's just take, for example, the European Convention of Human Rights. There's been a commission that's now been set up to look about whether or not we need to leave it. We've seen obviously news break this week that Lord Wolfson, who's overseeing that review and is the Shadow Attorney General, has said as recently as February 2025, he didn't think it was necessary for the UK to leave the European Convention of Human Rights. And honestly, David, as someone who put down a 10-minute rule bill, which is myself, on the floor of the House, that said that we should ignore the ECHR's rulings when it came to trying to get flights off to Rwanda, of which the Keir Starmer, Shabana Mahmood, Yvette Cooper all came from the shadow front bench office to come and vote against. But there was also 4 Conservative members of Parliament who voted against it too, of which, David, I must confess, you were one of them. Can you see why it's going to be very hard for the public to trust that if the Conservative Party says we must leave the ECHR, that you would actually do it?
The reason why we've got people like Lord Wolfson who are examining that issue is that we need to make sure when we put forward a policy programme that it's one that's workable in practice. And we know that there are lots of other countries, Denmark probably the most significant example, where the asylum rules are very significantly tougher than the ones that we operate in the UK. That, for example, doesn't provide permanent asylum. It says you can have 5 years humanitarian protection, then you have to leave, and they are busy deporting people at the moment under those rules. They have no barrier whatsoever from being a very active member of the ECHR to doing that in practice. And there's an awful lot of situations where, frankly, there are quite a lot of myths about this. Personally, I'm agnostic about the question about the ECHR more broadly, but we need to make sure that the policy programme that we're articulating is one that works in practice. And Rwanda, it's very clear. The moment this Labour government cancelled the Rwanda plan before it had even got going, there was a big increase in those small boat crossings because the loss of a deterrent has been a big factor. We know that Denmark, as I say, an active ECHR member, manages its immigration system differently to how we do it in the UK. And we need to be looking at examples like that. And we must remember the ECHR underpins family law, business law in our country. If you're in a situation where, there's a divorce in your family and you want to make sure you've got access to your grandchildren, it's the ECHR that protects those rights. If you're about to lose your business because the council is compulsorily purchasing land, it's the ECHR that protects your rights to get a fair price for that. So we could reconstruct all of that in British law, but the question is that the best use of time for a parliament that's got lots of challenges around employment, the economy, dealing with the actions of the Russians in a more uncertain world? Is rewriting legislation on a narrow technical point the most useful thing? And if Lord Wolfson comes and says the only way we can fix these things is to leave, then I will support that. I don't have a problem with it.
Well, David, it won't surprise you. I would obviously challenge for saying we're a common law country, and therefore we had life before the ECHR, we would have life outside the ECHR, and we would still be able to protect basic rights. If I may, David, final question from me. There was quite a punchy comment from Tory Conservative colleague of yours, Mark Pritchard, who accused Kemi Badenoch of bringing, and I quote, partisan politics into national security, after she accused Keir Starmer of evading PMQs to attend NATO and the G7. Can I just play a quick clip for you?
Whilst we may disagree on the detail, can I agree with the Prime Minister that as far as possible in this place, it would be better to keep partisan politics out of national security issues? And who knows, I may get the whip withdrawn for saying that, but so be it. There are things that go beyond party politics.
David, should he have the whip withdrawn?
Well, Mark is a good colleague, and I think the point that he's making about certain aspects of what were being discussed is that they do go beyond party politics. But Kemi was absolutely right to highlight the fact that it feels like Keir Starmer has been evading scrutiny. We know there's been all this stuff going on with this huge backbench rebellion that's fundamental to the budget and the economy of the UK. There are lots of things that emerged from what's been happening, the Israeli and American bombing of sites in Iran, where the Prime Minister seems to have been quite keen to avoid scrutiny. So I think she was right to highlight that. I can understand Mark making the point that he makes. It seems to me that within the broad church that is a political party, and the same is true when you were a member of it. You know, you were on one side of the Conservative Party, I was probably a bit more on the other side, but we have far more in common as Conservatives than we do that makes a difference between us, and it's important that we work together.
David Simmons, Member of Parliament for Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner, thank you so much for joining us today. Let's hear what your views. Do you think the Conservatives have a credibility issue, yes or no? Do you believe that they have a plan to solve the welfare crisis? And do you actually think that they would be bold enough to leave the European Convention of Human Rights? And finally, is Kemi Badenoch someone that you think can get her way to 10 Downing Street? Call in 0344 499 1000. Text in the word talk at the start of your message to 87222 and follow us and message us on X at talkTV. We'll see you shortly.
When we look at the savings that he was trying to make, £5 billion. Now, it may sound like a lot of money, but in the grand scheme of a big government budget, when you're spending, effectively trillions of pounds every single year, it's kind of small fry. The fact is, she's now going to have to find some money to pay for all of this, and it looks like taxes are going to go up, or some savings are going to have to be found from somewhere.
Across the UK, on DAB+, your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back here to the home of common sense. That is Talk, and my name is Jonathan Gullis, sitting in for the great Ian Collins here, and I'm joined in the studio with my good friend Matthew Torbitt, former Labour advisor. And before I quickly go to our next guest, Matthew, I just want to quickly read out this text from Catherine in Cardiff. Matthew Torbitt, it's not Torbitt, it's Torbitt, just so you know, Catherine, but Matthew Torbitt is not only extremely wise and measured, but also that rare bird of today, a man of integrity. Hope his mother is very proud of him. That's from Catherine in Cardiff. There you go, Matthew, just to make sure you get some love from the great listeners here at Talk. But let's get to our next guest. His name is Councillor Jamie McIver. He is the Director of Local Government for Reform UK, as well as being a sitting Reform UK councillor. Jamie, how are you?
I'm good. Good afternoon.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Jamie. Look, the story that certainly your political opponents have been wishing to push around is the fact that there's been a resignation from the leader at Warwickshire County Council, and his deputy, an 18-year-old boy called George Mitchin, I say boy, sorry, man, apologies for that, who was also elected in the recent local elections, has therefore stepped in to fill the void whilst a new leader is elected. There's been a lot of quite nasty comments. In fact, Conservative HQ even used their own X account to put out attack messages, as well as Kevin Hollinrake, the shadow minister in charge, the shadow Secretary of State for Communities, Housing and Local Government, as well as the local Labour MP Matt Weston, who oddly is very in favour of 16 and 17-year-olds having the vote, but it seems to be totally against an 18-year-old who's democratically elected being allowed to run the council. Jamie, is it fair for someone to roll their eyes and think, what on earth should an 18-year-old do, be running a county council with a huge budget?
Well, of course it's not fair, but I think, do you know what I think is absolutely pathetic from both, mainly from the Conservative Party, who seem to have jumped on this? It's like the other parties just look for any opportunity to have a dig at Reform because they're so petrified of the popularity of the Reform Party. But what has happened here is very simple. Every council has a leader and deputy leader. The leader was no longer, and we wish him well, it's for health reasons. And so the deputy leader has stood up as per constitutional duty and has become the interim leader until a new leader is elected and then appointed by council. It's proven that the Conservative Party know absolutely nothing about local government, which also kind of explains why all these county councils are in so much of a mess. They're in so much debt and there's so much inefficiency. It's scary. So clearly we now know true colours. Not only do the Conservative Party not have a clue about local government, they also actually are the nasty party, aren't they? Because why you would judge anybody on their age? You judge people on their actions, you judge people on their time in office. And if we're going to judge people on their actions and their time in office, the Conservative Party really do not have much credibility there at all.
Well, it won't shock you, Jamie. I find it quite patronising. In fact, if a party that said yesterday that they're not the party of pensioners, but then demeans someone who bravely at 18 years old has stood up and put their hand in the ring for elected office, being democratically elected, I think with quite a sizable majority, if I'm not mistaken.
62% of the vote. I don't know many Tory candidates that got that in May.
I've never got there, Jamie, so maybe one day I might be able to get close to it. But I mean, it's an extraordinary thing to see. And actually, you know what? I think what courage and what guts it takes, George Mitchin, I think, if I'm correct, Councillor George Mitchin, takes for him. Oh, thank you so much. Sorry for getting it wrong there. But it takes extraordinary courage to step up to the plate and say, you know what, I'm going to throw my hat in the ring and oversee this. Because he easily could have also said, you know what, if you're going leader, I'll go to and we'll just let someone else come in. But he's actually gone, you know what, I'm going to help and step in and oversee the day-to-day running of this council. And I think, quite frankly, it's quite petty and puerile, especially when the Conservative Party were happy to put 30 and 31-year-olds in the House of Lords for simply having been former advisors to Boris Johnson in 10 Downing Street. We all know how that ended in the end. I think that there's some irony in that. Now, Jamie, the YouGov MRP poll they asked David Simmons about, which shows that the near extinction of the Conservative Party, albeit he thinks let's just be calm, be patient and ride it out. Reform are promising the earth tomorrow and they haven't got a clue how to pay for it. Number one, is it disappointing? Because another Techni poll's come out today that shows that Reform have a 3-point drop, so hovering around regularly now 28 points, down from that high of around 30 to 34. Is Reform going backwards? Are they suffering from a credibility issue when it comes to policy by being not able to make the sums add up, as political opponents are saying? Or is it just the polls that they move here and there, but ultimately they still show a consistent Reform lead? And of course, I'm sure you're about to tell me, Reform gained 3 councillors in last night's by-elections.
Well, yeah, you've mentioned the by-elections. I won't mention that again, and that's becoming a consistent feature of these weekly by-elections. I think the first thing to remember is momentum is far more important than our overall position. Our overall position is very strong in the polls, and that's been proven on the ground with our excellent elections on May the 1st, but also every week since. But I think more importantly, you talk about credibility. Well, there is no credibility coming from the Uni Party whatsoever. And talking about sums adding up, for goodness sake, I mean, just look at the Labour Party bickering over the current welfare bill. I mean, sums are not adding up wherever you go when you look at what's happening at the moment with this government, when you look at what the previous government did. So as far as the Reform Party is concerned, we have a lot of credibility, but the one thing we have with the British people is trust. People believe in our leader, Nigel Farage. They want Nigel Farage to be the next Prime Minister of this great country. And the British people are sick and tired of the petty bickering that they're seeing between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. I mean, you just only have to look at Prime Minister's questions. It is such an awful representation of this country on the world stage every week. And I think the British people are just sick and tired. They're both as bad as each other. And that's why the Reform Party is going to be the next party of government with Nigel Farage as Prime Minister, because we have a leader that understands the British people, cares about the British people. And the Reform Party is the only genuine patriotic party in this country that believes in controlling our borders and that believes in looking after family, community and country. And the pathetic criticism that we have seen from the Conservative Party and the Labour Party in the last 24 hours over a young British man that has stood up constitutionally to look after his council with the resignation of a leader has pretty much just summed them lot up.
Do you accept, though, fair challenge, I'm sure you'll accept, that whilst you might believe you are the government in waiting, you're going to have a policy agenda that is bold, obviously, to tackle challenges, but also does add up, that you're going to have to show people that you can deliver? Are you going to be able to do that in time?
This country has been failed by both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party because they've been incompetent. The Reform Party is putting together a government that is going to be competent, that is going to lead this country to far better days. Obviously, things have to add up. Obviously, we have to have a fully costed manifesto. That is all going to come. The fact that we're talking as though there's a general election next week, the way we're being scrutinised at the moment, I personally actually quite welcome, because it's really helping make it a reality. But it's also showing that actually it's a realistic outcome if there's a general election tomorrow. And I just hope, and I'm pretty confident we're going to continue on this fantastic pathway of momentum, because I can see a pathway for this country to get out of this awful mess. And I do believe that the absolute sunshine for this country is going to be when Nigel Farage becomes our Prime Minister.
Jay McIver, Reform UK Council and Director of Local Government, thank you so much for joining us. Now, listeners, you've heard the Conservatives and you've heard Reform. Call in 0344 499 1000. Text in the word talk at the start of your message to 87222 or follow us on X at talkTV. We'll be getting more great reactions to the big stories of the day. But the big key question I've got for you is, will you forgive and forget Sir Keir Starmer's mistakes? Please make sure you tell us your views.
across the UK. On DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Good afternoon, it's Jonathan Gullis sitting in for the great Ian Collins. It's 2 minutes past 2 and we have got some great stories and guests coming up for you. With the first year of number 10 fast approaching, Prime Minister Keir Starmer is still racking up the U-turns, this time caving to welfare rebels on disability benefits and rowing back on his island of strangers immigration warning. Meanwhile, Britain's on the cusp of a new migration deal with France to curb small boats crossings, a one-in, one-out plan where each deportee from the UK is swapped for someone in France with a right to be here. And the government's tobacco bill is heading for a legal and constitutional car crash, with former Conservative Sir Robert Buckland warning it could blow up the Windsor framework, something I'd welcome, and break international law, something I don't necessarily believe in. So tell us what your views are. Call or leave a voice message on 0344 499 1000, text in the word talk and the start of your message to 87222 or tweet us at talkTV. And remember, what's the big question for today's show? And we will be reading the litany of texts and taking calls that are coming in at a great rate today. Are you willing to forgive and forget the Prime Minister's mistakes? The texts are saying not so well. But let's get on to our next guest. Her name is Kat Smith. She's the Labour Member of Parliament for Lancaster and Weir, and she is actually one of those Labour rebels that signed her name to the amendment, as well as being one of those who's also a select committee chair. Kat, how are you?
Afternoon, Jonathan. Can I start by correcting your pronunciation of my constituency, because I suspect I'll be getting angry emails if I don't. It's Lancaster and Wyre.
Wyre, there we go. Sorry,
yeah,
it's my terrible pronunciation, Kat. Well, thank you so much for joining us anyway. Kat, I'm sure your inbox has been heavily inundated from ministers and number 10 showing you their concession, which is to say that anyone on PIP here and now will be able to keep that, and it'll only apply these changes to those when the legislation comes into effect, which I think is November 2026. Can I ask, is the concession now enough for you to withdraw your name from the amendment, and therefore will you back the government on second reading on Tuesday?
You're absolutely right to say that the impact is busier than it might normally be on a Friday afternoon. It's obviously there's been quite a lot, and it's a fast-moving situation, and it has been for the last few days. The government's clearly moved. To be fair, the government's moved a fair bit. For me, it's not moved far enough. So I appreciate how far things have moved, but for me, the risk now is that we're creating two different systems depending on when you received your disability. So the idea that things obviously I welcome that if you know from my constituents that currently disabled or suffer from ill health. I'm really pleased that they're getting supported. But my issue is that I find it really hard to reconcile that with the idea, for example.
I'm sorry, Kat, just to interrupt quickly to say to you that the signal is not great, but we did hear, I believe, that you were unhappy with the two-tier system. We hope to get, by the way, listeners, Kat Smith back on the line. Obviously, bless her, she's out and about in her constituency too. And she was saying that she thinks the government has moved, she welcomes it, but not enough for her. Do you think the government can still survive this vote, Matthew?
Yes, we'll have to wait and see what people say. Kat is, someone you could probably place in the soft left, ally of Angela Rayner, previously resigned in opposition. So not a massive surprise. I think the assumption is because Meg Hillier seems very pleased, who obviously led this amendment and is the Treasury Select Committee chair, very organised woman, that others will sort of follow. I think the more moderate voices probably will follow, but I think it will be a substantive rebellion, certainly the largest that we've seen so far compared to those on the budget and winter fuel allowance. But they'll scrape through, I'd have thought. And actually, I don't know, what do you make of David Simmons not being very committed either way on what they're going to do? I thought it was bizarre how Keir had somehow got himself in a bind when Kemi is so inadequate, it's ridiculous. And she was offering him a way out if he didn't raise taxes and all other manner of other things. He was almost depending on her.
I was shocked because I think Kemi Badenoch gave a speech citing a Centre for Social Justice report that came out that said actually the problem with this welfare bill is it's targeting those with predominantly physical health conditions, cancer, as well as obviously Parkinson's. And actually they were talking about if you look at low-level depression, anxiety and ADHD, that's a much larger cohort and also where the growth is continuing. If you remove those people from receiving PIP and instead invest in them receiving talking therapies, that would not only save, I think, around £8 billion, but at the same time see a further 44% increase in the amount of talking therapies available on the NHS, which actually would then overall be a better thing. I thought that was quite a common sense thing, which is something that seems Kemi to have adopted, but doesn't seem to have trickled down from the leader's office through to her MPs. And I think the Conservatives, for credibility, if they're going to oppose things, which I have no issue with, they're going to have to say what they would do instead.
Yeah, and that's the same scrutiny you would expect Jamie McIver was saying about reform, but if they're heading the polls, they're going to have the same sort of scrutiny. The government is obviously the government, they're going to have the same sort of scrutiny, and it's right. It just seemed very odd to me. And I think you're probably right on what the CSJ's found. Everyone's sort of journey in life is different. I'm one of the 1 in 4 that suffered with depression, not to the point where I was on PIP, but I certainly went through a period where, I wondered whether I should be here or not, and you don't go into work and you lose jobs, and it isn't easy sometimes. But I feel like mental health is something that can be temporary, potentially, depending on your life circumstances. Some people have it forever, some people rely on potentially antidepressants and other things forever. But I think it is something that maybe potentially can come and go compared to a physical disease. And that's not to play it down. I think there's totally a parity in a big way. As I say, I speak as someone that struggles himself with his own mental health. But I think you can recover in a different way through talking therapies. I found my way through counselling in an amazing way. Short-term fix was antidepressants, definitely. But I'd like to think in certain cases, depression, anxiety, you can overcome that. You can't overcome Parkinson's or other physical ailments.
Like you, Matthew, I've had talking therapies as well, and it's been a huge thing. Can I just quickly go back to the line? Sorry, not to dissuade, it's a really important topic. Kat Smith, you're back on the line. Hi, Kat. Sorry about that. I know you're out and about, and you're kindly lending me your time whilst you're visiting your constituency. Kat, I just want to quickly say, I think I heard you say, and just want to make sure I'm correct, that you accept the government has made some concessions, but the concessions haven't gone far enough for you, and you worry about, and I'll use this term, not that you used it, but to quite a phrase, two-tier Keir strikes again, does he not, with his two-tier system?
That's very much your words, Jonathan, and not mine. My concern is that we're talking about health conditions. So, for instance, if you'd had a stroke last year and the disabilities that you were left with meant that you would qualify, my concern is that if someone who is in that sad situation, say in 2 years' time, then would have the same disabilities but not receive the same level of support. And that's where I don't want to get to, Jonathan. I think that if you are living with a disability, life is more challenging, life is more expensive, and that people should be afforded the same level of support, and with the same level of support would be able to access the same level of opportunities. And to me, that's the fairness that I'm looking to find. That's not where I'm at the moment. So, if you forced me right now, would I walk through a voting lobby for what's on the table right now? If you forced me to commit one way or another, I'd say that no, I wouldn't. But I'm, aware that we have a listening government. They've listened so far, and we've seen some real changes. I'm really pleased with some of the changes that we've seen, and I'm hoping that we might get ourselves into a better place by Tuesday.
Do you think it would be a smart move just for the government to actually withdraw the bill entirely and instead spend the summer recess to work with people like yourself and present it back in the autumn, where you can make the necessary changes that you need to make, and actually, therefore, this public spectacle can come to an end?
Broadly, yes, except I would question whether or not it's necessarily myself that the government should be speaking to. I'd say that we need to learn the slogan of the disability movement around nothing about us without us. We should be talking to disabled people, their families, carers and disability charities to make sure that we come up with a scheme which supports disabled people into work if they're able to, and make sure that those who can't work are well protected. And that would strike me to be a fair system, but it needs to be written and drawn up alongside disabled people. And I think that's been a big part of the conversation that's been missing up until this point.
Now, Kat, we know that coming towards the budget at the same time is also the government's child poverty strategy, in which there is a hope, I led to believe, amongst many Labour backbench MPs, there'll be a commitment to lift the two-child benefit cap. We know that Reform UK have parked their tanks on those specific lawns and said if they were in government, they would be lifting it. But the fear from the government is obviously that people like yourselves and others in the parliamentary party now have the taste for rebellion. If the government does not commit to lifting two-child benefit cap in the autumn, will we see another commitment from backbench MPs, an amendment to a piece of legislation that says it should be lifted?
Oh, you know I'm going to say this, Jonathan. I don't have a crystal ball, so it's very hard to speculate on something that's not happened. It is the will of the Labour Party to lift that two-child cap, and I am confident that that is what we will be doing in government.
And so if you'll be lobbying ministers right now saying they need to do it, are you that confident that despite the U-turns and despite Morgan McSweeney's hell-bent on being Farage light, that he's actually going to see through the two-child benefit cap?
You're an experienced politician, just as I am, Jonathan, and you know that even when, if you believe in something, you lobby for it regardless of whether or not you think it is going to happen. And I think it is going to happen, obviously, but regardless of that, I continue to put pressure on ministers when I speak to them about the lifting of the two-child cap. Of course I do. And you won't be surprised to hear me say that. No, and
when you say I'm an experienced politician, you're much better than me, Kat. You keep getting re-elected. So you must be doing something right, and I must take some lessons from you. Final one from me, if you don't mind, Kat. We've had this quite extraordinary interview from the Prime Minister with Tom Baldwin, the biographer of Keir Starmer, but also is a columnist in The Observer. He has interviewed Sir Keir Starmer, who has said that he deeply now regrets the comments that he made when he was talking about migration, where he used the phrase an island of strangers, citing things going on in his personal life that meant he hadn't been properly across the details of the speech and therefore hadn't properly vetted what he was due to say. Albeit, obviously, when that was challenged by Liz Saville-Roberts in the House of Commons, he said that she was talking rubbish. And, of course, it was billed before that speech as being a big reset and number 10, showing that Labour could be tough on both legal and illegal migration. As someone who I'm sure found that comment uncomfortable, do you accept the apology? Was that a welcome thing to hear?
I'm hearing it now from you, Jonathan. You are proving that you are indeed a news outlet, because I've been busy with constituency things as is normal for an MP on a Friday, so this is news to me. But no, obviously, I do welcome. It sounds like I should be welcoming that, and it's good to hear that there's been time to reflect on what was said there, because I think it was a really unfortunate. To be very generous, it would be an unfortunate turn of phrase, wouldn't it?
Obviously, I didn't find it uncomfortable for me, Kat, as you will know. But I think the Prime Minister was talking sense. It's the one thing I've agreed with him on. But look, Kat Smith, I know you're super busy and you very kindly volunteered to give some time up in between, I think, train journeys and the rest. So thank you very much for your time. We wish you all the very best and have a safe constituency day indeed. That was Kat Smith, Labour Member of Parliament for Lancaster and Wyatt. Well, Matthew, she's saying she's happy to hear the apology from Sir Keir Starmer for the island of strangers. Are you, as someone who used to as a Labour member, are you happy to hear that as well?
I think that phrase could have been used in a different speech. I think the comparisons of Enoch Powell isn't great. I think it doesn't look, admittedly, awful situation to have your home set on fire and somebody appeared to be obsessed and targeting you and whatever. You've got to know what you're saying, though. You're in charge of a country. If we were on a war footing or something like COVID again, you'd expect to know what you were saying when it's put in front of you, unfortunately. That's sort of the bare minimum. I actually think an island of strangers, from a speechwriter point of view, would have been better coming straight in off the back of the election. I think you could have described the lack of community in much of the country, the fact that you get your phone nicked and the police won't do anything about it, the fact that we all seemingly live online and don't speak to one another, the male role models that aren't around and children looking in dark places in the web, on the web, partly immigration obviously as well. I think that aligns with that, but I think you could have spoken about how a country full of community has been destroyed and we are now island of strangers. I think that would have been a better way of putting himself across. I think, it's great that he didn't, he doesn't really like that term. It's not great that he sort of read a speech that he'd never read before and therefore went, oh. But I did say, I think on this station, I noticed, I think I might say it to Jeremy Kyle, a very slight change he went a couple of octaves higher when he began to read that bit. And I thought, he's uncomfortable reading this. And now hearing this now, you go, I see why. He didn't know it was coming.
Well, let's get to the great texts of our listeners across the country. And thank you so much all for the messages and WhatsApp and text as well. I've got Barry here. Matthew, the loving for you is amazing today. Matthew is right. The focus of what happened at Bryce Norton has been solely on the perpetrators. No discussion at all about the obvious useless security. I think that is a very fair comment indeed. Tim here. Hi guys, UK RAF firefighter veteran from the 80s to 90s. This would have never have happened in my time. Sorry, line them up and throw away the key or worse. As far as I'm concerned, they put the whole base at risk. Very interesting indeed. We have another one here from Zoe in Lancashire. Afternoon, Jonathan. The way to reform the benefits is to look at overall spend and fraud, and migrants shouldn't even be allowed to apply for at least 5 years. Debbie Dobson, Matthew Torbitt, shame you're not a politician, because you're a shining example of how one should be, stating facts, talking truths, and not shouting or talking over people. Maybe Debbie's not a fan of mine then, at times, I must admit. Joanna from Salisbury, hi Jonathan. Safe and legal routes by application won't work. You get 500 apply, 75 get accepted. The rest will still jump on to boats because they are determined, because there is too much to offer freebies-wise over here. And then another one here from David. Jonathan and Matthew, in much of the same way I thought Boris Johnson didn't have a clue when it came to what he did and how he would appear to the general public, Keir Starmer is following this very same pattern. I can't work out if this is because the political elites of either flavour or colour have become so out of touch with the various sections of the general public. Starmer U-turning on his Islander Stranger speech with the explanation that he thinks his speechwriters didn't know how what they were writing would be received is something so bizarre that only Boris Johnson would have said it. I thought Johnson was an unlikely and chaotic Prime Minister. I believe Starmer to be the same. That's David from the Cotswolds. Well, listeners, we want your texts, we want your calls, we want your messages. 0344 499 1000. Text in the word talk to start your message to 87222. And of course, follow us on messages on X at talkTV. We'll see you after this break.
When we look at the savings that he was trying to make, £5 billion. Now, it may sound like a lot of money, but in the grand scheme of a big government budget, when you're spending, effectively trillions of pounds every single year, it's kind of small fry. The fact is, she's now going to have to find some money to pay for all of this, and it looks like taxes are going to go up, or some savings are going to have to be found from somewhere.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Well, good afternoon. Welcome back here to the home of Common Sense. That is Talk with me, Jonathan Gullis, sitting in for the great Ian Collins. And I'm delighted to have my friend and a great former Labour advisor in the studio, Matthew Torbitt, who many of you are giving a love in here on the texts and the calls, and rightly so, because I think he does speak common sense, and he would be, I think, a way the Labour Party could rebuild. And I'm not here trying to even get Labour governments, but I certainly think I could be tempted to campaign for Matthew if he were Labour, although I suspect he would say that my help wouldn't be very helpful to him seeking election.
Jonathan, I would have a broad church, believe me.
Well, there we go. Now we go to our next guest, and I'm delighted to be joined by friend here of Ian's show, Robert Taylor, a journalist and broadcaster. Hey, Robert, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you, Jonathan.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Now, Robert, there's a great piece here, a long piece, but a great piece from Talia Fraser, who's written for the Conservative Home, about Kemi Badenoch needs to stop running the Tory party like a family firm. Lots of disgruntled backbench MPs and indeed shadow cabinet ministers saying that she's surrounding herself with too many of her friends rather than too many people who are competent, that those people aren't listening or engaging properly with the backbench MPs, and in terms of building that team morale, and that quite frankly it's felt like quite a lacklustre start. How much in trouble do you think Kemi Badenoch is in?
Well, it's certainly a lacklustre start if you look at the only thing that really matters to politicians and indeed commentators like me, and that is, of course, the polls. She's not cutting through. Quite frankly, she's down in some polls to even, I think, the low of 14%, even number 4 behind the Lib Dems at some stage. Farage over the horizon. And, of course, the government always has an advantage over the opposition anyway in terms of setting the agenda. So the only thing that matters is the polls, and she's going to get criticised. And today she's running the Tory party like a family firm. But if she was at 25% in the polls, or even 35% as an opposition party should be, with such an unpopular government, none of this would matter. She wouldn't get any of this criticism at all. So she's facing an almost impossible situation. Whatever she does, Jonathan, she's going to get heavily criticised at the moment.
Do you think this is just fickle Tory MPs who just actually need to hold their nerve a bit rather than wet the bed because they've had a bit of a rough time, even though many people like yourself, and I'm sure even myself, have said to colleagues privately that this was inevitable, that the public weren't going to forgive and forget 14 years, particularly the last 4 years, to be perfectly frank, in a space of 12 months?
I can't help going back to 2022, summer of 2022, Boris Johnson, 4% behind Keir Starmer in the opinion polls, and the Tories lost their nerve and got rid of him. And it's been downhill ever since. So you're absolutely right. Of course, the Tories are fickle. I'm sure a lot of them are thinking, well, we need to replace Kemi Badenoch with someone else. I would say, who? Who do you think at this stage is going to do a better job than Kemi Badenoch? I don't know. I mean, I've heard people say, for example, Jeremy Hunt could steady the ship. And I see that. I get that. But another change? It would make the Tories even more of a laughing stock than they already are.
It's interesting you say that, because I do think there's a question in that if the Conservative Party enters into another leadership drama, does it not just reaffirm the very message that particularly Reform are saying, which is this party is so inward-looking, so inward-fighting, and is essentially just fighting for a position that frankly means nothing? It just proves that point. Would it not just see more members even probably leave to Reform UK and Conservative voters who are looking at the opinion polls and thinking, at the moment, if I want to get rid of Labour, then I have to, whether I like it or not, lump my vote in with Reform to make that happen?
Well, I would like to see a Reform Tory pact, because I think either one of them will struggle to form the next government without that pact. I think that possibly will happen. But in the meantime, I think the Tories have to stick with Kemi Badenoch. Not a great start by any means, but she's got the right ideas. I like her ideas about smaller government, government that stays out of business, government that stays out of our lives. That's very much my philosophy. It will come back into fashion one day. It'll have to, but it may not be in time for Kemi Badenoch to get into Downing Street.
And you obviously mentioned Jeremy Hunt. There's obviously a certain Robert Jenrick, or Bobby J as his supporters now nickname him, who regularly push around that he has shown the energy, he's shown the passion, he's showing the social media savviness to try and get some cut through. Do you think that people would buy him? Or as Michael Gove once famously said last summer in The Spectator, that Rob Jenrick suffers from being too much of a Tory boy?
Well, I do see that. But also, of course, he's been very energetic. I thought his campaign against people who dodge fares on the underground was just brilliant. I supported him on that. To me, I just can't see him doing much better than Kemi Badenoch is, for all his energy. for all his great social media campaigns, I do think there's a bit of the sort of Tory boy thing about him, which he can't help. That's just the way he comes across. And I think Gove was right to point that out. I think he's done really well as a sort of second in command almost. Replacing Kemi, I don't think it would make much difference to the Tory poll rating.
Well, very interesting indeed. If we go to our next story now, Robert, which is a great headline in the Mail. The useful idiots in the Prime Minister's ranks who blew up the law to prevent the hounding of veterans. Now, I must declare an interest. I was actually in the Northern Ireland office, serving as a parliamentary private secretary with the then Secretary of State Brandon Lewis in bringing forward what's known as the Legacy Act. And for listeners who aren't aware, this is when a line was drawn in the sand to essentially say there'll be no more prosecutions on either the British forces side or indeed continue what's already been in place. No more prosecutions of those, including IRA terrorists, for the troubles in the past. The line was drawn in the sand, and this would prevent the continuation of seeing certain ex-British forces being dragged to the courts in Northern Ireland. And a lot of anger around the fact in this country that the Labour Party has withdrawn that. And of course, Northern Irish parties all opposed it, albeit I would say from my own inside experience, some of that is a bit of face saving because they have to politically rather than actually really think that was the right thing to do. What's your view, Robert? Is this a disastrous U-turn or disastrous thing for this Labour government to do? Is it just leaving the door open now to more vexatious claims against our veterans?
Yeah, well, that is the big danger. And I was reading this morning, I'm sure this is a name familiar to you with your background, Jonathan, the case of Dennis Hutchings, who died in 2021. Very ill, of course. Just before he died, was brought to Northern Ireland to stand trial for something that happened years before in 1974, all dragged back in front of him when he was an elderly chap. In the throes of what turned out to be a fatal illness. Surely we can get some sort of balance here, Jonathan, between protecting the rights of those who were just defending their country back in the early 1970s against terrorists. And then, of course, we don't want to get to a position where soldiers can just take the law into their own hands. But I don't believe that ever happened, or certainly did. It didn't happen very often. So we need to get a balance. And I fear that we're swinging from one extreme to the other. And by throwing out this Legacy Act altogether, I think we are in danger of going back to these horrible, vexatious prosecutions.
I find it quite deeply upsetting, actually, because, as I say, it was a very difficult piece of legislation to get through. We knew that there would be unhappiness on all sides in Northern Ireland because, obviously, it means a family is not going to get the justice that they've always prayed or hoped for. But at the same time, the reality is there were many cases that simply were never going to come forward. And Tony Blair famously gave those letters that said, particularly to IRA terrorists, that they would be exempt from prosecution or they would only have to serve a maximum of 2 years in prison and therefore not have to face court again. There has not been any negotiation or fair sharing of information from colleagues in the Republic of Ireland, who quite frankly I think are complicit in not helping the British government find answers for those victims. And we know the majority of the cases are actually of IRA terrorists. I think it was over 80% of the cases are IRA terrorists who have killed civilians or British soldiers, and therefore this was going after a small thing. And I like you, think this is just whilst Labour wants to U-turn on some things in their manifesto, this should be a thing they should U-turn. Actually, until they've got a better solution, keep this in place to prevent seeing veterans being dragged unnecessarily through the courts. And Johnny Mercer, with some very strong words actually against veterans who voted for Labour, saying that they're complicit in allowing this to happen. And then another one, you talked about Robert Jenrick earlier with his stopping the fare dodgers. I mean, I don't know about you, Robert. I've certainly been on the Underground now a number of times. I've never seen so many people manning the gates for tap in, tap out, like I do now since Robert Jenrick did that video. Sadiq Khan has now obviously been shamed again by the Looking for Growth group going out and about and cleaning the Bakerloo line, I think, and the Central line a couple of times. We've got sort of activism from the street floor. Sadiq Khan now, how apparently he's avoiding cleaning tube on the graffiti in order to use this as a way to push for additional funding for TfL. How much more funding does Sadiq Khan need for TfL before he actually starts to make decisions on how TfL should be funded? Because I'm pretty sick and tired of the British taxpayer bailing out the Mayor of London.
Well, so am I. And, it just goes to show how this country is run, that we have to, apparently to demonstrate more graffiti on the Bakerloo line. And I'll tell you why that's particularly awful in a moment, because somehow that will encourage the government to give funding to overhaul the Bakerloo line and give more trains and all the rest of it. So we have to make it worse in order to prove to the government they need to give money to Transport for London. That's crackers. And I'll tell you why it's the Bakerloo line. Apparently, and it is the Bakerloo line, which anyone who's been in London will know is particularly awful for graffiti and horrible old trains. No CCTV on the Bakerloo line, apparently. So that's why all these horrible graffiti little thugs target the Bakerloo line in particular. And Sadiq Khan is accused by insiders at TfL of allowing this situation to get worse and worse and worse, then to say to the government, well, now you have to give me some more money.
It's pretty exhausting when you read an insider into TfL, and they actually feel, and you can almost hear the arrogance that drips off this quote, which actually, ironically, is the kind of arrogance that you see from Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, who said, and this insider at TfL says, anything that helps make the case for new trains, including the graffiti. I mean, what does that tell you about caring and compassionate? The capital city of our country that gets tens of millions of tourists each and every year, that is the heart of the financial sector and financial service sector across Europe, and in fact, in large part across the world. Probably the strongest legal system in the world that's used by many around here, that brings a lot of wealth to our economy. And the reaction is just to basically shrug your shoulders and hope someone. And as you say, the fact this is something as simple as CCTV is just mind-boggling. Does this just further feed into the decline of London? Actually, do you think, obviously with all London boroughs having elections taking place next May, do you think Labour are not going to just get hit by the unpopularity of Sir Keir Starmer, but there'll be certain parts, particularly the donuts they nickname it, of London, that will want to have to give Sadiq Khan's London Labour a bloody nose as well?
Well, yeah, I mean, the Tories weren't that far off. There were even hopes last year, weren't there, that the Tories might actually win London from Sadiq Khan. In the end, Sadiq Khan won it comfortably enough, but that was before we got Keir Starmer into Downing Street. And Keir Starmer in Downing Street is certainly not going to help Labour retain London. I've always heard that London is a Labour city. Well, it went to Boris Johnson as a Tory twice. I don't rule it out happening again, and I think Londoners will look at Sadiq Khan's record, look at the mobile phone theft, the graffiti, the lawlessness on the underground, and say, what's he done here? What's he done about knife crime? How has he made it any better since Boris Johnson left the mayoralty? And if they come to the conclusion, as I do, Labour's going downhill, then Labour could well lose London again.
Well, look, Robert Taylor, journalist and broadcaster and friend of us here on Talk, and of Ian's show in particular, thank you so much for joining us today. Listeners, you've heard it. What do you think? Sadiq Khan, does he need to buck up his ideas and tidy up? Is the Prime Minister surrounded by useful idiots? And does Kemi Badenoch get any cut through? Do you believe that she could lead this country one day? Call in 0344 499 1000, text in the word talk, the start of your message to 87222, and follow us and message us on X at talkTV. We'll see you shortly.
across the UK. On DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back here to the home of common sense. That is Talk with me, Jonathan Gullis, sitting in for the great Ian Collins, and I'm joined in the studio by a friend of us here on Talk and former Labour advisor, that is Mr. Matthew Torbitt, who continues to get love-ins all over the place. He'll be having to set up his own party. Maybe when Jeremy Corbyn sets up one, he'll be joining it to come and take over, because I don't think Keir Starmer's going to be welcoming him anytime soon. Matthew, are you planning to go to the Labour conference, by the way, this year?
That's the plan.
You've not had the invitation. You've not been banned yet or on the barred list.
Yeah, we'll see. Well, whether they allow me in or not, I am planning quite an important fringe event that I have to keep top secret because I imagine it will make national news, and that's all I best say on it.
Well, I hope, Matthew, that Talk will be exclusively invited in to see what's going in, and we'll be putting the pressure on you now to allow us that access so we can see what this great fringe event's going to be all about. Eyes glued for that when it comes in the autumn, ladies and gents. Well, let's get to my next guest. His name is Sir Robert Buckland, KC. He's a former Conservative Member of Parliament, as well as former Solicitor General, and Northern Ireland Affairs Committee Chair, and was a former colleague of mine as well. Hello, Robert, how are you?
Hello, very well, Jonathan. How are you?
I'm very good, my friend. Now, you are talking about the Tobacco and Vapes Bill, the risks-breaking international law and unravelling the Windsor Framework. I believe that you have said that at the heart of the problem is the direct clash between the bill's proposed generational smoking ban and the EU's Tobacco Products Directive, which continues to apply in Northern Ireland under the Windsor Framework. So while the bill would criminalise sales of tobacco to anyone born after 2008, the EU law actually still allows the legal sale of adults over 18. Robert, as someone who I did rebel against the Windsor Framework, I was right all along, wasn't I? The Windsor Framework was a complete disaster. This was always going to happen.
Well, it's not my role as a lawyer to say whether it was a disaster or not. I think it was an inevitable compromise, bearing in mind the really difficult issue of the land border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. But what it's thrown up, as in this case, is a real danger that in applying legislation across the UK, you start getting things snarled up between our domestic law here in Britain and the UK and the EU. And this is a classic case. And I'll say this, Jonathan, in the Republic of Ireland, they did consider doing this rolling generational ban on the sale of tobacco products. In other words, similar to what the UK is proposing in this bill. But because of the EU directive, the Irish government said, no, we're not doing that. We're going to have an increase to 21 for the minimum age before which you can buy tobacco products. Now, that will tell you, I think, a huge amount about the problem that we now encounter. So whilst we could, pass legislation to cover England, Scotland and Wales, this legislation, I think, could not just be challenged, but it could actually be disapplied by the courts in Northern Ireland because of the interplay with the protocol and the Windsor Framework.
So, out of interest, what would be the way around this for Northern Ireland? You obviously said about there having a specific law for just England, Scotland and Wales. Doesn't that just actually then lead to serious community tensions in Northern Ireland? I know that you've cared deeply about this, having been a former Select Committee Chair, and I think during my time as well, when I was a PPS, the Northern Ireland office as well. I know you actually made a big effort to visit the country regularly as well. Is there a way that maybe an agreement could be reached between the EU and the UK government where, for example, this could be allowed to apply in Northern Ireland, or is it more complicated than that?
Oh, there could be. I mean, as you know, Jonathan, something called the Joint Committee was set up to, in effect, to deal with disputes under the protocol. That's a committee headed by jointly chaired by a British government minister. I think that's Nick Thomas-Symonds at the moment, and Maros Sefcovic of the EU has been around a long time. And that committee has been the place where things like this could be thrashed out. But it seems to me that they need to thrash this out pretty quickly if this law is going to have effect, because the danger is the law is passed, then there's a challenge, perhaps, I don't know, from retailers in Northern Ireland who say that this is an unfair restriction on their right to trade, and you find then the courts not just saying this is wrong, but actually disapplying the law. It's similar to what happened to the legacy bill, the Armed Forces legacy bill that you and I actively supported when we were in Parliament, which has now been disapplied by the courts in Northern Ireland. In fact, this Labour government is now going to repeal that part of the legislation dealing with prosecutions. Very controversial, bearing in mind the vulnerable position of our service personnel who were serving our country in Northern Ireland through the Troubles. So, this is real, and this type of clash, I think, needs to be avoided before we end up with a real unholy legal mess.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, within the Windsor framework, there was a non-consent, so essentially would give powers to the Northern Irish Assembly to be able to say that they don't wish to have an EU directive or legislation applied to them. Are they able, in this case, to be able to use that, or is that would not be something, because it only stands for new legislation?
Correct. The Stormont break would apply to EU-based legislation. This would be a matter of UK domestic law. There has been a debate in the Assembly in Stormont about it. It broke down on lines of overwhelmingly people supported a ban because of public health concerns. I think there was one or two dissenters who just didn't like it for principled and philosophical reasons. But of course, it's not the place of the Northern Ireland Assembly to determine issues of UK law such as this. It is for the UK government to determine it. And my worry is that in this case, by just applying it UK-wide, they now fall foul of the Windsor framework and the protocol for the reasons I've outlined.
Robert, if I may just quickly come back, because you mentioned obviously the Legacy Act, and I just spoke earlier with Robert Taylor, journalist and broadcaster, about this, and the Daily Mail is now campaigning very actively when it comes to the fact they're very angry this legislation's being pulled. Obviously, someone like you, as you said, you and I were very working very hard. I remember you and Brandon Lewis, the former Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, working very closely in order to get this legislation in the best pace possible, knowing that it was going to cause upset on all sides of the argument in Northern Ireland, because ultimately it was going to say that justice wouldn't come forward. But ultimately, you and I, I'm sure, were arguing a line at some stage has to be drawn in the sand, and Northern Ireland must look forwards, not backwards. You obviously say the government is looking to repeal. From your experience, or can you remember, what alternative is there? What is the government maybe going to look at that could have been tried, that maybe at the time the government that you and I were part of chose to go down a different route?
Well, if you remember, when we did the bill, I was Lord Chancellor at the time when Brandon Lewis was Secretary of State, we balanced out the, as you say, the hard cut-off line on inquests and prosecutions. And mainly it's inquests are the issue, because the inquests, can go on for years and years. They do not provide the sort of closure, if closure can ever be achieved in these appalling circumstances, for families and victims and loved and survivors, and could, take years and years to resolve. We balance that out by creating the Reconciliation Commission, which is chaired by Sir Declan Morgan, former Lord Chief Justice of Northern Ireland, a very respected independent figure. Now, this government is going to allow that commission's work to carry on, which I think is sensible, but they're getting rid of the no prosecution, no inquest provision. And what I'm not clear about is whether or not the Northern Ireland Office have really thought about how the ongoing legal proceedings, which will now happen, sit with Sir Declan and his commission's work. Is the commission going to be stymied by the fact there are ongoing legal proceedings? And of course, we all have to be careful, don't we, about commentating and discussing and looking into the details of ongoing legal proceedings, because they're for the courts to determine, not for politicians or for independent commissions. And therefore, I do think that we are owed some more clarity, at the very least, from the Northern Ireland Office as to exactly what they propose to do. If they're just going to sit back and let inquests run on for years and years and years, that, for me, I think, does no service to families. And of course, it leaves a lot of our service personnel in huge doubt as to whether or not they might be called up or asked to give evidence, or in some way brought back in to legal proceedings for matters that happened often when they were very young service personnel doing their duty and serving our country to try and keep the peace in Northern Ireland.
Sir Robert Buckland, KC, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time here on Talk. We will see you, ladies and gentlemen, after the break. Remember, 0344 499 1000. Text in word TALK to start your message to 87222, and follow us on X at talkTV. We'll see you shortly.
it's pretty obvious that Number 10 are going to water this down, do whatever it takes in order to save face and pass legislation that goes nowhere near far enough to addressing the complete bloating of the welfare state, not just as it is already, which is bad enough, but all the projections about how much bigger it's going to get.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back with me, Jonathan Gullis, here on the home of Common Sense. That is Talk, sitting in for the great Ian Collins. And we have some breaking news to bring you. The Hainault sword attacker, Marcus Monzo, has been jailed for life at the Old Bailey for a minimum of 40 years for murdering a schoolboy and attacking 2 police officers and 3 more members of the public. That has just come in just now. The Hainault sword attacker, Marcus Monzo, has been jailed for life at the Old Bailey for a minimum of 40 years for murdering a schoolboy and attacking 2 police officers and 3 more members of the public. We'll, of course, bring more as that story evolves. If I quickly now go to my guest in the studio, friend of us here on Talk, that is Mr. Matthew Torbitt, former Labour advisor. Interesting, Matthew, in the break there, you and I were just talking about the tobacco and vapes bill. I was making a big old rant about why this proves the Windsor framework was a disaster, why I was one of 22 Tory rebels at the time, because we have put a border down the Irish Sea and allowed the separatists and the nationalists to try and carve away Northern Ireland from our great United Kingdom, which I will not stand for. And my friends in the Democratic Unionist Party and many others, I will be cheering on and backing to make sure Northern Ireland stays an integral part. But you give a challenge which said there was a certain word that both Robert Buckland and I were avoiding. What was that word, Matthew?
That was Brexit, because neither side during the debate wished to talk about how fragile peace in Northern Ireland is, how Brexit would attempt to try and manoeuvre around the Good Friday Agreement, and it has caused a huge load of issues, including a border with Northern Ireland. I visited Northern Ireland last year to do some research, and I spoke to people on the Falls Road, I spoke to people on the Shankill Road side of things, and it can't be underestimated unless you go genuinely how close we are to violence, probably the closest we've been since the Good Friday Agreement. And I think part of that is the rise of the sort of drugs gangs, and what those that call themselves the IRA now are essentially just sort of drug gangs and drug runners and whatever else. There's obviously concerns over immigration, but Brexit was a huge issue there, massive issue that I think was totally underestimated, and therefore we're now in this position where if you're going to pass laws for the UK, you've got to basically pass a separate law for Northern Ireland, but try and fit it around elements of international law, because this is the other thing with things like the ECHR. I can totally foresee an argument of leaving. I can, and it's a compelling one. But I think where do things like Northern Ireland, that are always sort of forgotten about for those outside of Northern Ireland, factor into issues like that? And that's, I'm worried that the ECHR will be sold as very much a silver bullet at election time, a bit like Brexit was. Anyone that voted for it now probably feels shortchanged because our borders are seemingly more out of control than they ever have been. And it's the unintended consequences that I feel like we should maybe talk about more around these issues.
And it's interesting you raised that, Matthew, because obviously we had Jamie McIver, Director of Local Government and Reform UK Council, on earlier, who was making the case for Reform being the only patriotic party in British politics. And obviously Reform are saying we would just leave the ECHR. Do you feel this is where Reform are coming up against the buffers a bit, where they have to actually give the detail, the substance and the consequences and what they would do to overcome those, such as, fairly, the Good Friday Agreement, albeit that being underpinned by the Human Rights Act. But actually there is still that huge question of what would that mean for the Good Friday Agreement if we were to leave the ECHR. And Reform UK themselves debating internally, allegedly, as rumoured and printed recently, that they're debating whether or not to even stand candidates in Northern Ireland, which would be very different to how the other main political parties have operated on this side of the Irish Sea. Do you think this is where Reform UK falls short? When I put that question to Jamie about the policy being now the Achilles heel for Reform in terms of the substance, his response being, you'll see that in the manifesto coming forward, don't worry. Is that, have Reform got time? Or do you think they're going to have to start giving detail now?
Well, they've probably got time, but and in a way they can ride the crest of a wave of the mainstream political parties having failed people, or seemingly that's how people feel. So they've got time in the sense of they could ride on the crest of this without a manifesto as it currently stands. I think Nigel is very good at the flippant answers of, you know, I think I saw an interview with him the other week. Well, no point in having targets. Governments have had targets for years, they never hit them. We're not going to bother having them. And people are won over by that because there's that element of the status quo that feels like, as Joe blogs at home, that they've failed you. You've not done very well. Again, I worry about the simple answers, though. I saw the party chairman, Zia Youssef, on a different channel with a Labour representative debating, and he just got mullered. This is not me wearing my Labour Party apparatchik either, my sort of uniform. He got mullered because it was things like, well, you know, we'll just ignore international law. It's all well and good saying that. If we all start doing that, then what? That's when the world becomes a little bit more dangerous. There are obviously loopholes that are being manipulated, absolutely. I don't think having human rights across the board is necessarily a bad thing for lots of people in this country, though. And the idea that he also went on to say, well, what we'll do is we'll just deport people that come here. Do you think if it was that easy, we wouldn't be doing that now? It would solve a hell of a lot of problems for people, especially salubrious people that come here, and you sort of go, these people shouldn't really be here, but we're tied into elements of the ECHR. So I think they'll come up against it, maybe not in the election, but if they were to form a government, that's when they would realise, because I saw Dominic Cummings the other week. He explained in very great detail Whitehall is the issue. Isn't the government necessarily, it's the fact that permanent civil servants will not allow you to change much of the framework that's already there, and that is what will stand in people like Nigel Farage's way.
I agree. I thought Dominic Cummings actually gave a very interesting talk and done a number of interviews. But let's get to one of our callers. His name is Phil. He's from Stafford in Staffordshire, where I obviously reside. He is an ex-Conservative Party member, so I don't know if we met Phil, and if I have, I hope it was in a good sense. And he believes the Conservative Party is finished because of this one nation approach. Hello, Phil. How are you?
Hi, Jonathan. I look upon you and Matthew as the good guys. I think you're both around the money, but you're missing an important point, because you can talk about policy, you can change the leader, you can do whatever you like as far as the Tory party is concerned with policy and leadership. The bottom line is that they don't have the will, and neither do the Labour Party, and there's massive evidence. There was a really good piece by a former colleague of yours, Marcus Fish. I don't know if you know Marcus.
Yes, I do, yeah.
He gave a piece on a rival channel just after the election, and it was headed something like, why the Tory party should be put out of its misery. And his bottom line was that there's never any prospect of the current Conservative Party taking full advantage of capitalising on Brexit or getting migration under control. And you've heard the Labour Party as well talk at length about migrants are our friends. You've got Yvette Cooper holding up a sign saying basically migrants welcome. And the difference with reform is they might not have. You can argue and say, well, they're going to come up against this, they're going to come up against that, but what they do have that the others don't is conviction. If something won't work, I have every confidence that reform will try something else, and they'll keep trying until they hit the mark, until they get an answer. And there's no confidence that the other parties will do that. And so you can talk about they're going to come up against the buffers in this respect or that respect. They might do, but they've got conviction to get the job done, which the others haven't got. Lord Frost confirmed the situation with the One Nation Tories as well. The only way I would ever come back to the Conservative Party is if the One Nation Tories left the party.
Well, Phil,
it's irrelevant, and I think, and you know, we've got a big task here. We've got to save this country, and I would hope, Jonathan, you would see the bigger picture and come across to reform, because you've got the right ideas, the right attitude, and the right skills to get the job done. Well, and the same for you, Matthew, to be honest.
Matthew, do you want to respond to Phil there? He's telling you to join Reform UK. You've got the right ideas, right values. Any chance you could go?
I'm telling you, Jonathan, as well. You need.
I'm gonna tactfully dodge Phil, if you don't mind. Obviously, being the presenter of the show, but I hear you, and you're not the first to pose that question to me. And look, I've been a member of the Conservative Party for 18 years, which is pretty tragic. My entire adult life to have devoted all those weekends and evenings delivering leaflets and knocking on doors. I'm sure Matthew, albeit a shorter life than me, and looking much better for his age than I do. But it's a very tough thing. It's a very tough thing.
I was a party member, Jonathan, for 10 years. I came in to get Brexit done, and it's broken my heart to see how it's been treated. We had a real good opportunity to capitalise on Brexit, and it was been squandered by the Conservative Party. I'm not just annoyed with them, I loathe them for their treachery.
I'm sorry to intervene, Phil, because I've got to get ready for a break, and I want to make sure, Matthew, thank you so much, Phil from Stafford, for that call. Matthew, 20 seconds. Should you and I go and be joining Reform, or do you have hope still the Labour Party can find the right path?
The Labour Party will find the right path if they get rid of Keir Starmer. That's as simple as it is. No, that's not even.
I love you, Matthew.
I think the only way Labour could ever even appeal to anyone again is to put somebody like Andy Burnham in, who is not tied to many of the unpopular decisions that have been made in Parliament.
The Mark Carney approach of airlifting someone from the outside
has to
in.
be outside of the building. That would be the best route, I think.
Well, listeners, you've heard it here first. 0344 499 1000 for your calls. Text and word talk to 87222 or message on X at talkTV. We'll see you soon.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Good afternoon. We're in the final hour with me, Jonathan Gullis, sitting in for the great Ian Collins before you get joined by Peter Carville, who will be taking you through your drive time special. Thank you so much for joining us and tuning in, and for all the amazing texts and calls that we have had come in so far. I'm joined in the studio by my great friend and friend of the channel here, Mr. Matthew Torbitt, former Labour advisor. And coming up, with his first year in number 10 fast approaching, Prime Minister Keir Starmer is still racking up the U-turns, this time caving to welfare rebels on disability benefits and rowing back on his Island of Strangers immigration warning. Meanwhile, Britain's on the cusp of a new immigration deal with France to curb small boat crossings, a one-in, one-out plan where each deportee from the UK is swapped for someone in France with the right to be here. And In this week's Talk Crime, we focus on Samantha's legacy, a charity born from the tragic story of Samantha Magdkin, an 18-year-old new mother fatally stabbed in 2007 and trying to break up a fight in her hometown of Wallsend. Please make sure you keep tuning in and calling, obviously, calling us and leaving us voice messages, on 0344 499 1000. Text the word TALK to 87222 at the start of your message and tweet us at talkTV. And the question of the day still remains, are you willing to forgive and forget the Prime Minister's mistakes? And we're going to go to another friend of Talk, and he is the Deputy Political Editor of The Spectator. That is Mr. James Heal. And James, I'm going to start off by posing that very question we're posing to our listeners. Do you think, with all this apologies we've had in today's Observer today from Sir Keir Starmer, along with all the U-turns on winter fuel, national grooming gangs and now welfare, that Keir Starmer will be forgiven and forgotten by the electorate?
I think that it will certainly not be completely forgiven or forgotten. I think there are chances for Labour now to make better use of the next 4 years than they have the last one. I mean, it's been extraordinary talking to people within the party. Is that sense of disappointment that pervades things. I remember the party conference last October in Liverpool, and the sense of frustration, irritation, how underwhelming it had been was really palpable, much worse than some of the Tory conferences have been to over the few years. And I suspect that this upcoming conference in September is going to very much be a continuation of that. And that, unfortunately, is a bad reflection on how Keir Starmer's done in his first year in office.
From the contacts you have, James, do you think it's fair when we read the briefings that are coming out that Keir Starmer has not been meeting with enough backbench MPs, there's not been enough parliamentary outreach, that ministers are feeling frustrated even as well because things seem to be taking too long to get through? Is that a fair challenge to Sir Keir Starmer? Does there need to be a look at the operation? Or is it just a classic case of MPs desperately seeking to blame advisers rather than actually looking at the principal, the man who makes the decisions, who in this case is Sir Keir Starmer?
It's a bit of both, Jonathan, is the short of it. There's always the sense of, not getting enough face time with the Prime Minister. He's not listening to me. If only I, the humble backbencher, was the Prime Minister, we'd be 20 points ahead in the polls. There's always a degree of that. Equally, I think that it's very clear that Keir Starmer has made a bad habit of marching his troops up hills and then leaving them back down again. And therefore, you sort of speed run the Boris Johnson years where you get people unable to go out and defend the government line because they know the government line is going to change. And clearly also, they've underestimated the scale of opposition to anything approaching welfare spending cuts. So I think that it's been a painful first year in office for Labour. Some hard lessons, but they don't seem to be learning too quickly, do they?
No, not really. And actually that YouGov MRP poll that came out, James, which showed obviously remarkably Reform UK, albeit short of actually being able to govern on its own, but still going from 5 to 271 MPs. Labour losing hundreds of seats all the way down, I think 100 behind, if I'm not mistaken, Reform UK. But then, amazingly, the total and utter collapse of the Conservative Party, and your colleague, the political editor of The Spectator, Tim Shipman, has written a piece this week that's really got eyes widening when it comes to the fact that there seems to be a lot of despair, even within key allies of Kemi Badenoch, that backbenchers, particularly newbies, feel that they're not seeing the energy from the front. And there's a lot of what Talia Fraser's written in Con Home today, that she's running it too much as a think tank rather than a political party, and surrounding herself with too many friends rather than actual political operatives. What do you think of the Conservatives' demise and Reform's rise?
Well, I think that some of it isn't her fault, but also Kemi Badenoch clearly isn't taking the party forward. When Rishi Sunak left, they were narrowly ahead in the polls of Labour, and now they're sort of down to about 15%. So I do think that that's real cause for concern. I think Kemi Badenoch has listened to some extent. There's been a bit of a step change since the local elections, and we're going to see apparently more policy commissions, more talk of speeches and sort of ideas being rolled out in the next 4 months or so up until the party conference in October. But it's not going terribly well, it seems. And the real thing for the Conservatives isn't necessarily also that they're getting thrashed in elections, it's that they're not putting up candidates anymore. So there was a line in my colleague Tim Shipman's cover piece this week talking about Norfolk, where they weren't standing council candidates. That's a Conservative-held seat. Another one, just this morning, I haven't seen the result of it yet, but it was a council ward in Mel Stride's seat. That is one of the 120 Tory seats currently held, and they're not even putting candidates there anymore. If you don't do that, you lose out as a political party. And the reason why Reform is doing so well is organisation is the key to success. Concentrate your voters, getting over the line, and they're doing that much better right now because people actually know what reform stands for and think it's something new and sexy and fresh. And for all of those things are quite lacking with the current Tory party.
Now, I spoke with Jamie McIver, the Director of Local Government and a Reform UK councillor. He says that, look, everyone is scrutinising us as if we should have our fully costed and written out manifesto now. In fact, they welcome that scrutiny because ultimately it shows they must be on the verge of government. Otherwise, no one would be asking for that. But do you think Reform are going to struggle with the credibility? We've seen a number of policies announced recently where there has been some quite scathing criticism around how the sums add up. Dan Needle, yes, a Labour member, but also a well-respected economist by, I think, both left and right, said that there'll be a £34 billion black hole in this Britannia card. Do you think there's an element of credibility that's going to hamper Reform? They do appear to have gone slightly backwards in the polls, hovering around 28% now rather than around the 31% mark. And quite frankly, many have said they seem to be kind of missing from the pitch. We've not heard much around the grooming gangs U-turn from Keir Starmer. That was actually Kemi Badenoch out front and centre. Again, on welfare, they've kind of kept quiet too. Is there a credibility issue? Is there a Farage exhaustion and therefore too much relies on his shoulders? Or actually is it just Reform maybe need a bit of douse of reality, maybe after being slightly too arrogant post the local elections, which I think we can all say went much better for them than any of us had planned or expected?
Yes, I think that Reform certainly has a novel internal political culture. I think most political parties tend to be sort of moderate in their expectation management. Sometimes with Reform, it sort of veers between exhilaration and despair to an extent. So it's either sort of all the way up or all the way down. And so you saw that with the kind of amazing local election results, and then boom, 3 weeks later or so, Yusuf resigns. So it's about getting the balancing right, proving that actually it's a steady, lasting, reliable, enduring political force. We've got a long way to go to the general elections, 4 years or so. I think it is fair to say that, they're going to be choosing their interventions. They're not going to be speaking out on the chamber on every different issue. And that's actually, to an extent, the Tories' problem, which is they have to, as the opposition, respond to everything the government does. And they're quite thinly stretched. This is one of the criticisms you hear, which is why people say, well, you're going to reshuffle the shadow cabinet. Well, unfortunately, there isn't that much talent on the backbenches because there isn't that many people left. But so Reform are trying to make the best of what they've got in terms of resources. They think they're building, certainly. But I think what we're going to see over the next 4 weeks, Jonathan, is a bit of a calm before the storm. And they're planning a big summer push. And we wait to see what great sort of exciting things they're going to be doing with that.
And then, James, this story today coming out that the UK government seems on the cusp of potentially being able to deal with France, a one-in, one-out migrate system, which would mean that, and I just want to make sure I get it right, that a Channel migrant would return to France if they've come here by small boat within 3 to 4 weeks, with the very occasional exception for those with strong family connections. In return, we would agree to take a capped number of asylum seekers from the EU. For example, it says here in the Telegraph's article, around 20,000 a year under a time limited scheme. Do you think this is going to be a good news story for Sir Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper? Are they going to be able to stop the boats and smash the gangs?
I think that it has the potential to represent some progress in that it could probably deter some people from crossing. But the reality is that given the awful circumstances, let's be honest, facing some of these people, given the attractions and the great pull factors of the UK, and given also the fact that actually, it's still going to be effectively rewarding people crossing across the continent by giving them a legal route as well, I'm not terribly sure it's going to get rid of all the pressures that are there associated around small boats. Yes, it might mean less pictures of boats crossing, and it can enable them to claim a victory in terms of going out there and saying, we've actually got 25,000 rather than 50,000 people arriving here. But ultimately, I do think that the small boats thing is much bigger than this. So there might be this great deal. I remain sceptical of it. We'll wait to see the details. And of course, the key thing, of course, it needs to be in both France and the UK's interests. And actually squaring that circle has been quite a challenge since 2018 when this crisis began.
It won't shock you, James, that I think this is a terrible deal. I think it's a complete disaster. I think that it's going to actually act as a pull factor to northern France. It will actually only mean the smugglers have a larger customer base in which to recruit from, and mean that people might well try the legal route that's going to be set up from France into the UK. And if that fails, they'll just then pay the smugglers that like they intended to anyway and still come over, and we'll see an armada cross the English Channel once again over the summer, which I obviously we need to deter urgently, because I am appalled to see that we are unable to stop this crisis. And so, yes, it won't shock you, James, that I think it'll be a disaster, especially when the government's still got 109,000 asylum claims being made to the year end March 2025, and they've seen an 88% increase in the amount of appeals as well, and still a 50% acceptance rate again as of March 2025. Or am I just being grumpy, James? Because obviously I'm no longer in Parliament, and my Rwanda plan that I was very keen on didn't ever get to take fruition. And should I just be willing to maybe try a bit? A Kit Malthouse compromise, who I know was very pro this idea. God help us all.
Well, yes, the first thing to say, I remember the headlines last year, they called it the Great Stumharder, crossing the channel. So I think you're right to be sceptical. I think that, within the Home Office, there's a sense of, will this actually work or not? I think some think it's sort of along the right lines of worth trying, and they want to have Anglo-French cooperation. But the key thing, of course, as you alluded to there, Jonathan, is that there is no deterrent. There is no deterrent on the sale of Rwanda. There are talks ongoing, I understand, for about 5 or 6 return hubs across the continent and sort of 10 Albania-style returns deals. But we've heard this, and you'll have heard this more than me, for years now. The truth is it's just going to be very difficult because the incentives are such that to stop these people coming here is going to make it almost impossible. And for the French will never care as much about people leaving their waters as the English will people coming in here. So I think it's going to be very difficult to see how this does it. It's going to be Starmer's big set piece thing on the 8th of July. But like so many small boats initiatives beforehand, I fear that this one is not going to anyway plug the leak.
Now, James, finally, we go back to the Labour Party. Obviously, the welfare reform U-turn is significant, and significant concessions estimated to cost around £3 billion from the £5 billion they were hoping to save. And now, of course, with the winter fuel U-turn, around £1.25 billion in that regard as well. So around the £4.5 billion mark if we're rounding up. Obviously, Labour would probably rather I rounded down. But still, a black hole that's now being created for Rachel Reeves, on top of having to find money for increase in defence spending, and of course the fact that the UK is seeing still debt interest rates remaining very high, which is obviously going to further exacerbate her budget, and further a massive, again, borrowing and spending splurge, as we saw with the spending review with many of those projects likely to take a decade or more, rather than the 2 or 3 years that they need in order to try and demonstrate real change in delivery, even though some of those long-term decisions are welcome and are needed, and politicians must have 10-year views. And a government that's seeking to try and redefine the narrative and move on into phase 2 as they keep briefing out of their governing, do you think that this U-turn is just going to keep costing more and more? For example, the 2-child benefit cap surely is now just something that Starmer's going to have to give way onto, which will be, another £2.5 billion there?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, if you add the welfare U-turns in terms of winter fuel, universal credit, PIP changes, that's about £4.5 billion according to the Resolution Foundation. You add 2-child benefit on the top of that, that's 1p increase in the basic rate of income tax. Now, what does Rachel Reeves do to resolve that? There was a report by Capital Economics last week which suggested that she'll need 20 billion of tax rises. If we have these changes in welfare as well, she might have to go even higher than that. So, she said to the Chancellor constantly since last October, I'm not coming back for more on the scale of what I just had. That was a budget which raised taxes by about 38 billion. Increasingly, what's it originally say, 23 billion and 38 billion? They're both pretty big revenue-raising budgets. And so the question then becomes, does she choose to do that by raising lots of little taxes, or does she go ahead and just break the tax pledge, which was that the Labour Party wouldn't raise income tax or VAT? Does she just go ahead and say, put one last thing, 2p on the rate of the pound? That could be something that they does, because I think the key lesson from these welfare cuts, Jonathan, is that people really feel that something's been taken away from them. You look at the farmers, you look at the winter fuel, the pensions, etc. They all feel like something's been taken from them. Diffuse benefits, concentrated costs. Labour are finding it really difficult to scale those back, and that's the key lesson I think from 12 months in office, that people don't like having things taken away from them.
And final one from me, James. We're starting to see now a lot of what appears to be slowly but surely briefing from number 10 against number 11, where Rachel Reeves is sat. Do you think she's on the clock? Do you think that she's going to be a sacrificial lamb to save Keir Starmer's premiership at some stage?
Well, how many sacrificial lambs has Keir Starmer had since he became leader? He's been through about 4 chiefs of staff. It was pretty brutal for throwing Stu Grey under the bus in his Observer piece today. She wasn't the right person for the job. Ouch, So I think that it's possible, definitely possible. And what's so striking to me, Jonathan, is it's just that, the Tories think that she's not up to it. There's a poll out today by Labour List showing that she is wanted, 46% of Labour members want her to be sacked. So if the Labour membership are turning on her, her colleagues think that she's to blame for a lot of this, and the Treasury is being held as having the whip hand in this government, I think it's very unlikely that Rachel Reeves will serve the rest of this Parliament as Chancellor.
James Hill, Deputy Political Editor of The Spectator. Thank you so much for joining us. And listeners, remember, keep tuning in. We've got some more great guests, and then you've got some more great insight from my good friend and a friend of this station, Mr. Matthew Torbitt, coming up later. The question, are you willing to forgive and forget Starmer's mistakes over this past 12 months? Call in 0344 499 1000. Text in the word talk to 87222, or follow our messages on at talkTV on X. We'll see you shortly.
It's pretty obvious that Number 10 are going to water this down, do whatever it takes in order to save face, and pass legislation that goes nowhere near far enough to addressing the complete bloating of the welfare state, not just as it is already, which is bad enough, but all the projections about how much bigger it's going to get.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This
is the home of Common Sense, and I'm Jonathan Gullis, sitting in for the great Ian Collins here on Talk, and I'm joined in the studio by Matthew Torbitt, former Labour advisor and friend of us here at Talk, and we have had some great texts coming in. I've had Lisa challenge me, fairly so, saying, Jonathan, you were very flippant with the last caller who sounded genuinely gutted about how the Conservatives are let us down. I know how he feels. That was Phil from Stafford. Lisa, I don't think I was flippant. I think I laughed because ultimately I've said for a long time on this station and on others, I think the Conservative Party brand is so badly damaged. I don't know if it can ever recover, and I find that very difficult as a member, someone who's been a councillor, been a council candidate, been a parliamentary candidate and a member of Parliament, and in fact even ended up serving as deputy chairman of the Conservative Party. It breaks my heart, and believe me, I'm not flippant. I don't think that we have the right people enough in Parliament to be able to come up with the solutions that you will believe and trust that we would deliver, and I think there's going to have to be some sort of deal at the very least with Reform UK if the Conservative Party is going to stay relevant. But why on earth would Reform, with the momentum they're having, even entertain a deal? That's the question that I'm sure I will pose our next guest and another friend of the studio, of the station here at Talk. That is Mr. James McMurdoch, Reform UK Member of Parliament for South Basildon and East Thurrock. James, you heard me there just say, interested in a deal with the Conservative Party? Any chance, or why on earth would you even bother?
Yeah, not for me today, I'm afraid. There was a very interesting by-election in Wickford, actually, which I'll just draw some attention to. Now, Wickford was one of the places where the Conservative Party did manage to hang on. And if you look at all the by-elections from the start of May, the Conservatives have not won a single election. And this was one that I was quite curious about because, one, it would put our very first Reform councillor on Basildon Council, which is a hot topic for us because it's an important place and a lot of work needs to be done there. But also, as a real opportunity for a place where the Conservatives had done relatively well, all things considered, to put their flag in the sand and possibly start their comeback. And if you look at the numbers, which was very interesting, is their numbers stayed very, very stable compared to the previous results in years prior. But what happened literally everywhere else is the numbers entirely collapsed and Reform still took the lead. So even somewhere where the Conservatives may have really thought, look, it's been a year, let's put our might behind this, let's turn things around, they still, unfortunately, or unfortunately for them, I should say, came a cropper. So, look, a deal just doesn't make any sense at all. And also, when I talk to Reform voters, they're just not interested. And that's not callousness. That's not a lack of sympathy for, the UK's oldest political party. It's just a practical reality, and you see it in Parliament as well. There are, I would say, and being quite candid here, 30, 40 MPs which are proper Conservatives, but that's just a third of the total base. So they've got problems and they're not even willing to face them head on, or they don't even have the people to. So in terms of a deal, it just makes no sense whatsoever.
And with that MRP poll that came out from YouGov that showed obviously that you would be on the cusp of power, albeit still short of an overall outright majority. Do you think that's actually sometimes a good thing? Look, someone like me would say the numbers show that you are in that particular poll on 26% of the vote. Techni released a poll today saying you went down 3 points to 28. There's been a bit of a backward step since a bit of internal back and forth with Zia Yusuf and a bit of policy that's come out that has been criticised quite heavily by large parts of the media, as well as obviously your political opponents, over being whether or not the sums fiscally make sense or not. Do you think it's obviously polls move, maybe the electorate's just volatile, but do you think actually it's quite sobering because you can then make the point to voters, particularly those who are currently sticking with the Conservatives? We understand why you might want to stick with the Conservatives. You may have always voted that way, but if you want rid of Labour, there's only one choice, which is to vote Reform UK, which is to flip what the Conservatives were saying against you guys at the last general election.
Yeah, and I think it's very difficult to underestimate or to overestimate, just how significant that is. And one of my very first events as a member of Parliament was with a farmer who had, in my constituency, who had stuck with the Conservatives against her sort of desire. She described it as holding her nose and still voting Tory. And she said to me in her own words was, actually, that was the mistake. I should have been bolder and braver. And now with the polls supporting that very same point, it could really, really open the floodgates for the Tories. And exactly like I said with the result in Wickford, where the Conservatives had held relatively strong, they still lost. So there's absolutely no love for Labour whatsoever in Essex. And if the Conservatives can't win in one of their strong places there, then they just don't really have a voice. And that's extremely damaging for them. That could really, really be, I think, more damaging than people actually even realise, even though we're speaking very poorly of them.
There's obviously a lot of talk about Kemi Badenoch and her future. Some suggest that maybe Robert Jenrick should come in and take over, and many would say that he is the one who can take on Reform. We're seeing the jazzy social media videos. We see that he's been very outspoken when it comes to the ECHR. Others would say, in Reform, we welcome Robert Jenrick. He's a pound shop Nigel Farage. He's the semi-skimmed, not full-fat version. Does Reform fear Robert Jenrick? Would you be worried about him taking over?
No, I don't think that's quite the way of putting that. Look, I'm country first. If the more people in Parliament start recognising what the real priorities for the country are, and they use their voice and their influence to control our borders, to try and reduce the waste in government and to try and lower taxes, then look, I'm a friend of those principles, so I'm all good for that. Do I think Jenrick poses any sort of serious threat in any real way? No, I don't. I think his credentials and his credibility just isn't anywhere near that. Could that change over the next 4 years if he does an absolutely stellar job? It's something to watch out for. But I think people who pay attention to this kind of thing are just not sold.
No, thank you very much, James. And look, we've got a great tweet from you that I must say made me chuckle this morning. Your tweet shows some pictures of Glastonbury versus the pictures of the defence of an RAF base, where you've said, can we all agree that our military bases should be at least as secure as Glastonbury? Obviously, you're referring to the action of Palestine Action, where they broke into RAF Brize Norton, damaged military planes, have now been prescribed as a terrorist organisation. But a Telegraph have seen that they've identified 3 sites where they would like to obviously try and cause more havoc. First of all, are you embarrassed that this is a state of defence of our military bases? And thirdly, are you welcoming of the fact that they're a prescribed terrorist organisation?
So look, I think what we really need to focus on, and it's no laughing matter, is just how dreadfully serious any attack on a military base is. There's things that I just won't say on camera, but there are things that I'm aware of that make me very uncomfortable, and I am of the exact and specific opinion that quick and decisive actions need to be taken by government to change things around. £55 million worth of damage to military equipment done effectively by yobs on e-scooters, and that's to compliment them and not call them terrorist activists. You know, yobs on e-scooters, it's a humiliation. And I think actually, when you take the jokes aside, we need to think quite seriously that neighbours, allies, enemy states, people who do not joke, people who do not have a sense of humour at this kind of thing, have just seen a very serious breach. And without drawing on historical parallels, if their intentions had been even more severe at that time, we could be looking at an absolutely historic and devastating moment in time. So it's a very serious matter. It's a very serious matter, and quick, decisive, very deliberate action is required.
And James, obviously you're talking about security. Obviously there's always security regarding our borders hot in discussion. We see that the UK government apparently is close to doing a deal with France where we have this 1 in, 1 out, where we would return people back to France within 3 to 4 weeks if they don't have a strong family claim. In exchange, we would agree to take a certain amount. The Telegraph suggests maybe up to 20,000 from the EU in a show of good faith. Do you think this 1 in, 1 out scheme has any chance in helping stopping the boats and smashing the gangs?
Look, it's just tinkering around the edges, isn't it? If the small print of it means that we're getting 50,000-60,000 migrants on dinghies popping across and risking their lives, we shouldn't underestimate that. Risking their lives by coming across the ocean, and we replace that with a cap of 20,000, then look, that's a net positive. I'm not going to be particularly excited about it. I'm not going to be impressed by it. And look, there's other things I've had. I'll share it because I don't think it's a problem too, but I don't know how airtight it is. But I've heard that women and children, for example, will just be flown over rather than face the ferry. At least it's safer. But in essence, they'll do that to just artificially deflate the numbers of people that are coming into the country via dinghy. So we're just flying them in. All of this just shows how desperately out of control we are in terms of being able to control our own borders because of our desire to put international law first. And look, international law is vital for world security, but when international law stops making sense, that's just as bad as outright disregarding it. So we have to have law both nationally and internationally that genuinely makes sense. And just having international law that means rapists, murderers, complete unknowns just get to hide and tag along across the ocean, and they're here for, here in a couple of hours after a dinghy. It's ridiculous beyond words. Everyone knows it. I know it. You know it. The man in the street knows it. It's an embarrassment we've not done something about it already.
Do you worry, like me, that this could actually act as a pull factor? One, first of all, it's a bit weird that we'd be swapping migrants, basically, who've illegally already entered mainland Europe. And secondly, why not, if you're a smuggling gang, promote the fact you can come over here, you can try the legal route that's now being set up in France, or you could try the dinghy. And of course, if you try the legal route and are unsuccessful, or you get turned back, or your application gets rejected in France, then you'll just still pay the smuggler anyway. It's not actually really going to deter people trying. It just means, as you say, it's another route. And in fact, I think you hit on a really interesting point there. How will the government put the figures of those who come through the legal route, and how will we see those figures compared to those who also come through on small boats? So that way then, as you say, will Labour just be artificially moving the spreadsheets around in order to give the appearance that somehow small boat numbers are reducing?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I agree with you. It could just be, an extra avenue for people who want to have a crack to exploit. And look, I think we've all been young men once. A lot of these guys, they're 25, they're from poor backgrounds, they're not in danger, and this isn't an adventure. I don't think people realise that enough. For a lot of these kids, this is just an adventure. They get to muck around in camps, they've got nothing better to do anyway, and if they manage to get across, they'll have had a bit of excitement. Yes, it's dangerous, but unfortunately that does add to it for some people. They've had a bit of danger, a bit of excitement, they've got a story to tell, and they get themselves an e-bike and a smartphone, and then they're blipping around working for Uber Eats, earning pretty decent money, basically risking carefree. So it is just another avenue for these people to explore and exploit, and it makes a mockery of the really serious stuff and the privilege of being from a wealthy country where we can help real and genuine refugees. You know, that's a moral responsibility that I think we should all be very proud of. When it gets muddied with hundreds of thousands of people that just take the mick, really, we just end up with egg on our face.
James Murdoch, thank you so much for joining us today. That's Reform UK Member of Parliament, James Murdoch for South Basildon and East Thurrock. We will join you shortly after the break.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back with me, Jonathan Gullis, sitting in for the great Ian Collins on the home of Common Sense, that is Talk. And I'm again joined in the studio still by friend of the station, Mr. Matthew Torbitt, former Labour advisor. Before we come to get Matthew's views on that interesting interview there we had with Mr. James Murdoch, Reform UK Member of Parliament, we are going to our usual segment, which is Let's Talk Crime. Each week in association with CrimeCon, the world's #1 true crime event, we delve into the minds of criminals and those who chase them. From the psychology of offenders to forensic breakthroughs and the fight against wrongful convictions, we bring you gripping insights from some of the biggest names in true crime. And this week, we focus on Samantha's legacy, a charity born from the very tragic story of Samantha Madgen, an 18-year-old new mother fatally stabbed in 2007 after trying to break up a fight in her hometown of Wallsend. Samantha's family, her mother Alison Madgen MBE and her sister Carly Barrett MBE, have turned unimaginable grief into a powerful force against nice crime. And I'm very pleased to say Alison and Carly join me now. Good afternoon, both of you.
Good afternoon.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And what is, my heart hurts when you read these things, and your bravery to turn that hurt into action is something that we should all admire, and thank you for that. And I just wanted to sort of ask, first of all, a bit about what Samantha's story is, in case any listeners aren't aware. If Alison, maybe you don't mind sharing.
Okay, yeah. Samantha, she was 18 years of age. She just had a baby 10 weeks previous and decided to go out just to meet up with friends on the night out, go out driving in the cars. It was a lovely hot summer's evening. They went down the coast, had a drive about, and on that evening she bumped into 4 people who, one was Jordan Jobson. There was a little bit of an altercation. Samantha's, the 2 that were with Jobson, 2 males, there was a bit of an altercation with Samantha's 2 friends. She tried to break up a fight, and Jobson, who was a 15-year-old girl, decided to come out and stab Samantha to death, and she died at the scene.
And Carly, obviously, since that terrible ordeal, and obviously justice was then, obviously a trial then followed, and her murderer convicted, yourself and your mother, Carly, have obviously launched Samantha's Legacy in 2019, I believe, on what would have been Samantha's 30th birthday. Do you mind sharing with listeners what that work is that you're doing and how you're trying to help people in what is obviously a very serious issue that sadly is all too often on our screens?
Yeah, so Samantha's Legacy, we began by looking at education, and we thought, using Samantha's story, telling Samantha's story to young people would give an insight into the reality of knife crime. So we decided that we would start sharing, we would start educating young people. I feel like we always have, quite a big impact in school assemblies when we meet young people, because it's real and it's raw, and sometimes it can be quite emotional for us and for the audience. But we also support victims of knife crime as well, and we launched in 2022. We launched Samantha's Retreat. So in that way, all that was through our own experiences and how we felt that we could learn from our experiences and make things better for others.
I'm going to quickly throw over to Matthew Torbitt, who's in the studio with me, and I asked that because Matthew has got an amazing backstory where he's had to overcome adversity. Matthew, do you want Alison or Carly any questions yourself?
Yeah, I think, first of all, cannot commend you highly enough for channeling such an awful event into a positive, essentially. I'm a big believer in trying to overcome adversity by channeling it into something particularly impacting your community, and I believe in the power of community. I'd like to ask you both, because words can be very trite, but for someone that's been through it, what would you say to somebody, no doubt watching this later on social media, a child, boy, girl, whoever, that may carry a knife? A lot of the people I come across that I mentor or go into prisons and visit will say, well, I carry a knife for protection. What would you say, both of you, to someone that says that and has that knife, and try and get across the impact that can have on people like yourselves?
I would say to, research our story and realise that, carrying a knife, using a knife, it has consequences, and not just, for 1 day, 2 weeks, 2 years. We have been living this life, the pain of grief and, at the beginning, very much torture. And, it's us living the life sentence, and it's us who have to find the strength to carry on. And fortunately, we are a family who have found that strength, but there's other families out there who certainly don't have that strength.
Alison, sorry, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just like obviously what Carly says, just think about the consequences, and there's always somebody out there for that young person. The answer is don't carry a knife. There's always somebody there who they can reach out to. There's always support there. Make sure, just go out and find it. If there's troubling them, carrying a knife is not the answer, and think of the consequences of themselves and the victims and their families.
I think just to pick up as well, you mentioned support there. How important was support for you both during, first of all, this time, and also channeling through into the charity and the work that you're doing? I think, lots of people may fall by the wayside because of that lack of support. How important has that been for you both?
to be honest, there was very lack of support. Obviously, we had a baby to bring up as well. Callum was only 68 days old. We had no support there. We have a very strong family and very good friends, and I believe that's definitely how we got through it. And more sight, that gave me more insight to see how victims are treated as well, and how important that support is. And a lot of families, just little things like you could be the main breadwinner of the family and everything's cut from you that day. That family, they've got no wages, they've got nothing, there's all the bills to pay. Little things like that people don't even realise, that all goes into one as well.
Thank you both, and thank you for the important work you're doing on prevention. It will go some way to helping other people.
Colin Alison, sorry, if I can just quickly also ask and follow up about this, the play that's being based, Our Sam, which debuted, I think, at Whitley Bay Playhouse on January 30th and 31st. It's an amazing sort of use of being creative in order to try and get across an important story. It explores the themes of grief, family trauma, knife crime and lost potential, while celebrating Samantha's vibrant personality and love, of course, for her son. How was that process in going about that, and how did you actually get to the point where this play was able to be put on?
It was a very emotional. It was, for us when we were at the rehearsals, it was almost like watching our family life as when we had Samantha playing out in front of her. I think every day, no matter how many times we'd watched it over, it was emotional, but the impact that it had was great. It really was.
And Alison, how well has it been received? Do you know if you've managed to engage with local schools and get young people in front of it, or indeed obviously just the wider public who have been hopefully giving you very positive feedback on it?
Oh yeah, the positive feedback was amazing. We had a lot of schools there to come see the play. Unfortunately, it's not on a long run. Obviously, funding's usually the answer to that. But I mean, just seeing when the girl who played Samantha, I even got Samantha's clothes, and she actually wore Samantha's clothes. They were wearing Carly's clothes, Lee's clothes. They all came out of the loft, and to bring the character to life, and it was so well done. And for a victim side of things, and to show how the justice system worked for us, it was a great way of seeing that. But one of the best things that we heard was a lot of people saying, wow, I won't be carrying a knife anymore, and I certainly won't be hanging about with people who do.
That's brilliant. And final one from me, Carly. What was it like for your mother and yourself to receive an MBE? It must have been quite a moment to get I'm assuming a letter through the post maybe that came along, or did you get a phone call?
Yeah. So it was a letter that we received through the post. It was. I didn't quite believe it at first, and I think I read the letter like about 5 or 6 times, and then I was just amazed, and it just kind of gives that validation of the work that we are doing is it's valued, and we still do have hard days where sometimes we find it difficult to carry out the work that we do, but having that MBE and knowing that we're recognised like that, the work that we're doing is recognised, it just brings that purpose, and it gives me more fuel for the fire to carry on the work and to do even more than what we're doing now.
We live in an era where these gongs, these titles, I think, are overly given out to people, but both of yourself, Alison, and yourself, Carly, are more than deserving of it. And in fact, again, I just want to say a massive thank you for sharing that, what would have been a very painful story to keep sharing, but to turn that grief into action, and for the impact you're making. And I hope that many young lives will be changed and engaged with what you do. After a successful weekend in London, the next CrimeCon hits Manchester on September 27th, 2025. If you've enjoyed today's episode, remember you can download and listen to all Talk Crime podcasts on your favourite podcast app. We'll be back after the break.
it's pretty obvious that Number 10 are going to water this down, do whatever it takes in order to save face and pass legislation that goes nowhere near far enough to addressing the complete bloating of the welfare state, not just as it is already, which is bad enough, but all the projections about how much bigger it's going to get.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome here to Talk, the home of common sense, with myself, Jonathan Gullis, sitting in for the great Ian Collins, and in the studio with me is still good friend of the station, Matthew Torbitt, former Labour advisor. And before we get to Peter Cardwell, who's obviously going to have another great show, I'm just interested. We had James McMurdoch on earlier. He was certainly taking, what I say, quite a different tone to what would be expected from Reform, a refreshing kind of different face maybe for Reform when they're trying to win over a broad voter coalition. What do you think, Matthew?
I think they could do worse than using him a lot more on the media. I've not seen James do much media. That might be just me. He came across as likeable, affable, sensible, normal. And I think the one thing a bit similar to Nigel at times, he answered the question directly. Now, you might not like the answer, or you know, whatever it is he's got to say, but this is what people get fed up with. There's the whole idea of a politician's answer and somebody pontificating and not really answering the question they've been asked, answering a totally different one. So, no, I thought he'd come across well, and I think, you know, maybe it says more about me at the moment, but I didn't disagree with him necessarily. I think, you know, that so there are people that are taking the mick out of loopholes. I think when it comes to the fast food and Deliveroo and Uber Eats and all these other sort of companies, I think the buck stops with them rather than the individual. I think if you're desperate and don't have any money because you're not allowed to work, you're going to find a way to get money legally or illegally. And I think Uber, you know, these delivery companies know exactly
They should be facing fines, Matthew. You know, I've said this. It's corporatism, not capitalism. And these companies should be facing fines, because ultimately, if it was a small family firm or, let's say, a local takeaway and they were found to, I bet the full force of the law would be felt upon them. It's amazing how Deliveroo, despite now what is quite obviously wide scale, we're yet to hear the government say we're going to send in the National Crime Agency, or we're going to be using police resources to actually fund to cover how many people within their network are involved in this illegal trade, and therefore find out what I'm sure elements are some modern slavery, where people will be taking the money and then only giving pennies on the pounds, as it were, to those who are obviously in those hotels.
Yeah, so the focus on the individual isn't really going to solve the issue, because as long as these companies don't change anything necessarily, or tighten up identification checks on who's actually working for them, this is obviously clearly going to go unabated. There's no reason for them to stop doing it if they've got more and more people working for them on you know, pittance essentially. But I think he was right in the sense of, you know, the returns agreement, if you want to call it that, is essentially tinkering. There needs to be wholesale action to tackle what is essentially a crisis, because it impacts every element of, you know, you can't be letting in 1 million people a year and not expecting that to have an impact on housing and infrastructure. And the fact that, you know, most people can't get anywhere near a doctor or a dentist, and that is the real life politics that is going to affect the election.
It was interesting. He said that actually this country should be proud of what it's done for refugees. Obviously, he would rightly say he was talking about refugees, whether they're from Hong Kong, whether they're from Ukraine. And actually, I think that's what's sometimes misunderstood with the Reform position, is that some people, particularly in more metropolitan areas like London, think Reform are against, or this country is somehow now turning into an anti-migrant place. Actually, I think it comes back to what you've always said. It's about fairness. And the problem is when people are seeing people coming on small boats, they feel that this is gaming the system, jumping the queue. It's not fair on those people who are in legitimate war zones, or are experiencing major poverty, or are indeed maybe family members who were left behind by others who went ahead, and they're simply trying to reunify. Is that just a case that actually sometimes that Labour may be sort of trying to pander to trying to talk tough on migration? Now Keir Starmer's wrote back on that bizarrely today, saying he now deeply regrets using an island of strangers. In fact, actually, what Labour should make for is a positive case of the UK has a global standing. It should look after those most impoverished, and at the same time, you can still want to protect your borders.
Yeah, I think, you know, most people, you talk about post-World War II and the things that we did there, people would go, yeah, rightfully so. And I you know, I can't speak for the country, but I have always believed in a moral duty of the strong helping the weak, and that there is an element of where we have been there for people, and rightfully so. I think where that falls down is you've got to make sure your own house is in order. I wouldn't be having someone come and stay with me if all my windows had been put through and had not hoovered the carpet. You've got to do the basics right first in your own house before you can begin to try and help the others. And at the minute, it feels a little bit like a third world economy that we're living in, and very fractious, and therefore people aren't always as generous and as willing to open their arms up to people who also may be suffering.
Now, Matthew, on the text, we've had a question posed by Sharon in Wigan, who says, Matthew, why is Starmer doing a deal with France? We want the migrants stopped, not swapped. Are they trying everything to destroy the UK?
I don't think they're trying to do everything to destroy the UK. I think it is because he doesn't want to maybe delve into the stuff I've spoken about on trying to reform the ECHR or the idea of what a refugee is and you know, call a convention and whatever else. And I think it's essentially, sadly, wanting to look like you're taking action and doing something. And there may be something in what you and James McMurdoch spoke about, in the sense of potentially manipulating numbers, because certain people can now be put in a separate group of numbers because they may have come over legally on a plane, or how many have come over essentially on a boat, and how that sort of is. So my fear would be maybe number manipulation and looking like you're willing and doing something on this, rather than actually doing it, if that makes sense.
We've got another one here from Stuart in Perthshire to carry on the Matthew Torbitt love in here, which says, does Matthew realise that he's the only person on the Labour side that is liked and respected by almost everyone on the right? I hope he never changes his attitude. There you go, Matthew. You're gonna have to join Reform, I think, at this rate. The amount of people that are talking.
Well, you say that. I mean, the one moniker I used to get in Parliament, which I thought there used to be worse things you could go by, is people would say he's the nicest man in Parliament, you know. I thought you've got to be willing and respectful. I disagree with lots of stuff with you, but that doesn't mean I ever went for you. I thought we need to try and... Consensus building is the only way countries move forward, and you might start there, I'll start there, and you try and find a way to meet in the middle and move forward.
No, absolutely.
That's the way you've got to be.
We've got some more text coming here. When we posed that question, will you be able to forgive and forget Keir Starmer's mistakes in this first year? No chance. Starmer will be forgiven. Not be forgiven. He's a political driftwood. From Southport onwards, he is dead in the water. Another one. Keir Starmer should become a stand-up comedian. He's so funny, and the best part is that he doesn't know it. That's Don from Chelmsford. And another one here says, zero chance of a reform Tory pact. Farage felt betrayed by the Tories after standing down on Brexit Party candidates in 2019. And another one, does the Island of Strangers apology count as a U-turn? He did previously double down on it. That's Jamie as well. Now, I'm delighted to be joined in the studio by the very great Mr. Peter Carwell, who had that amazing exclusive. Well done, Peter. First time I've seen you since then, of getting Sir Keir Starmer, albeit online conspiracy theories went a bit nuts when you were in Staffordshire, in my neck of the woods. And next time, let me know so I get you a cup of tea and a cheesy oatcake so you can enjoy yourself.
The best comment was a friend of mine who said, even though you were interviewing the Prime Minister, the biscuits were never far away. They were just behind you on the cooker there. Yeah, I should have said hello, certainly, and thank you very much. It's hard to believe a week has occurred since then.
What a week.
What a week, my goodness. The fourth capitulation in a month, basically. It was only 2 days ago that Keir Starmer was at NATO and talked about the fact that this was noises off. Well, the noises got pretty loud. We're talking about that. We're also talking about the person I believe is the most dangerous person in this government, the much under-examined Lord Hermer. He says that two-tier justice is a myth and is offensive to even mention it. We'll be talking to him as well. We'll also, at the top of the show, just after the 4 o'clock news, be talking to the Labour criminologist himself, Patrick Maguire. He's written 2 books, including one I'm reading at the moment called Get In. He knows this inside out, and there's an incredible quote that I can't read out at 4 o'clock in the afternoon in his column in the Times today that I would highly recommend you read about how some of these backbenchers are thinking about Keir Starmer and his analysis and indeed his handling of all of this. We'll talk about Palestine Action being arrested on terror charges. We'll talk as well about the weather, of course. It is very hot. I don't know if you noticed that.
Yes, I'm struggling.
Yeah, it's come across your radar. Certainly, we were talking to Joe Wheeler. We'll also talk to Richard Bergen, who is a Labour MP, and Richard Holden, who's a Conservative frontbencher as well, Ben Habib as well, and have a little peek inside the Sun in terms of what they are discussing tomorrow. No doubt what Keir Starmer is talking about will be front and centre.
Well, very briefly, I must say we had Kat Smith on, one of those who signed the amendment, and she says that while she accepts the government is making moves, it is not yet gone far enough. Do you think Keir Starmer's in danger of not being able to get this bill passed on Tuesday?
I think there could be some danger. Certainly, look, there are some people like Richard Bergen, I would imagine he'll never be happy. One of the questions I want to ask him is, what sort of welfare reform would you be happy with? How would you save the taxpayer money on all of this? But there are people maybe a little bit more in the middle of this who will, I think, vote for this. People like Meg Hillier, who's been in charge of this rebellion. But there are others sort of in between Bergen and Hillier, people like Annie MacDonald, who I actually had a chat with this morning, and he was